Clint Eastwood, a name that echoed in every corner of Hollywood, walked into the courtroom with the kind of swagger only a legend could possess. But today, it wasn't the applause of a movie premiere that filled the air. No, today, the atmosphere was tense, charged with an energy that bordered on hostility. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as cameras flashed, capturing the man who had become an icon of strength, grit, and stoicism. Clint wasn't here for a film. He was here to defend himself in a legal battle that had turned into a media circus. As Clint took his seat, his presence seemed to command the room, but the judge wasn't impressed. The judge, a young man in his 40s, wearing a polished suit and a smug grin, scanned Clint over his glasses, clearly dismissing the gravity of the situation. Well, the judge began, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The great Clint Eastwood in my courtroom. I must say, I didn't expect to see you here, Mr. Eastwood. From cowboy hats to courtrooms, huh? Guess your acting career wasn't enough for you anymore. What's next? A reality show? The room fell silent. The judge's mocking tone hung in the air, and for a moment, it felt as though the whole world was watching Clint's reaction. There was no applause this time, no cheering fans, only a hush, as if everyone was waiting for the actor to crack. But Clint didn't flinch. His face remained a stoic mask, as unreadable as it had always been in his career. He sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled together, his gaze fixed on the judge. The judge, perhaps sensing that Clint was not the type to be rattled, tried again, pushing further. I've seen it all, Mr. Eastwood, but nothing quite like this. A man who made a living pretending to be a hero, now playing the part of a defendant in my courtroom. What a twist. I hope you're ready for the ride of your life. A low murmur of laughter rippled through the room, but Clint stayed quiet. His eyes narrowed slightly, but that was all. The only sign that perhaps this was more than just a legal matter to him. At that moment, it wasn't just about the court case anymore. It was about something deeper, something that Clint wasn't ready to reveal. The judge continued his condescending remarks, but Clint's mind was elsewhere. He wasn't here for the mockery or the jokes. He wasn't here for the public spectacle. No, Clint was here for something bigger. And the judge had no idea what he was dealing with. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Clint suddenly spoke, his voice cutting through the judge's tirade. The courtroom fell silent again. Clint's words were strange, almost out of place. But there was a reason for it, something that would unfold as the case progressed. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? He added, addressing the unseen audience beyond the courtroom walls. It was as if he were speaking to someone, a larger world outside the confines of this small space. The judge blinked, taken aback by the abruptness of Clint's words. The audience could sense the shift, though no one dared to interrupt. It was as if Clint was reminding them, this wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was the beginning of something much larger. Clint's eyes flicked to the other side of the courtroom, where a sea of reporters sat, their pens poised, eager to capture every moment. The media had been relentless in their coverage of the case, painting Clint as an old man past his prime, a former star trying to hold on to the fading remnants of fame. But they had no idea what was coming. As Clint sat in that courtroom, surrounded by his past, present, and the eyes of the world, something deep inside him began to stir. The man who had lived through countless life-or-death situations in his films, who had stared down the barrel of a gun in the name of justice, was about to face something far more dangerous. A real battle, and no amount of mocking, no public ridicule, would stop him. In the midst of the tension, Clint took a slow, deliberate breath. The kind of breath he'd taken 1,000 times before on movie sets, in scenes where the stakes couldn't have been higher. He had faced down enemies in fictional worlds. Today, however, the stakes were real. He was in a fight for his freedom, his reputation, and possibly his life. The judge seemed to sense the change in the air, and he faltered for just a moment. But Clint didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. Instead, he leaned forward, a quiet confidence emanating from him that commanded attention. The judge cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the room. Mr. Eastwood, it seems you're here to play a game. Well, you've picked the wrong courtroom for that. Let's get this over with, shall we? His tone was sharp, a direct contrast to Clint's calm. But Clint knew this was no game. Suddenly, Clint's calm facade shifted. With a smooth motion, he reached into his jacket pocket. The room grew quiet as all eyes were drawn to his actions. Clint's fingers slid over something metallic, his hand resting on a small, inconspicuous object. It was the kind of thing no one would expect from a Hollywood icon, a symbol of authority that spoke volumes without a single word. The judge leaned forward, intrigued, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Without warning, Clint produced a badge, a United States Secret Service badge. The room froze. For a moment, it was as if time had stopped. The judge's eyes widened in disbelief, his face paling as the weight of what he was seeing sank in. The reporters in the room looked at each other in confusion, unsure of what to make of the sudden revelation. The once mocking judge now found himself in the presence of something far greater than his own legal authority. A Hollywood icon, yes, but more than that. A man with deep connections to the government, to a world that the public rarely saw. The courtroom was stunned into silence. Clint didn't say a word as he placed the badge on the table, the glint of it catching the light. It wasn't just any badge. It was a symbol of something far more powerful than anything the judge could have imagined. And in that moment, Clint Eastwood wasn't just a defendant in a courtroom. He was someone no one could underestimate. What had started as a mockery, a simple courtroom drama, had just become something much more. The question now wasn't about Clint's legal trouble. It was about who he truly was and why he was here. And the judge? He was about to find out the hard way. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The courtroom still hummed with an uncomfortable tension, the weight of Clint's revelation settling heavily in the air. The judge, still attempting to regain control, cleared his throat, but the energy in the room had changed. Everyone's gaze was now fixed on Clint. No one was sure what had just happened, but it was clear that this wasn't just another celebrity trying to avoid the consequences of their actions. Clint Eastwood wasn't playing by the same rules. For the people in the room, Clint Eastwood had always been larger than life. His name, his voice, and his face had become synonymous with Hollywood's golden age. From his role as the iconic man with no name in the good, the bad, and the ugly, to his portrayal of gritty, no-nonsense police officers in Dirty Harry, Clint had carved out a legacy as a symbol of strength, independence, and justice. His characters were the ones who stood firm in the face of overwhelming odds, the ones who never backed down. But behind the on-screen persona was a man with a much more complex story, one that wasn't just defined by the movies he starred in. Clint's journey had started far from the lights of Hollywood, in the small town of San Francisco. Born in 1930, Clint grew up in a working-class family during the Great Depression. His childhood was far from glamorous. He didn't have the silver spoon many of his peers enjoyed. Instead, Clint learned early on that life wasn't easy. His parents, a steelworker father and a homemaker mother, worked tirelessly to provide for him and his sister. But money was always tight, and Clint knew what it meant to go without. He often spoke about how the rough conditions of his early life shaped his personality. It wasn't just the long hours his father worked or the harsh economic climate. It was the resilience that grew within him, the need to fight back against adversity. The man who would become known for his stoic silence and unyielding character was forged in a world that didn't offer much in the way of second chances. But Clint wasn't just tough by circumstance. He was also a natural talent. Even in his youth, he stood out, not only for his strength but also for his quiet determination. His first real love was baseball, and he played with a passion that seemed to infuse everything he did. Yet, as life would have it, his dreams of becoming a professional baseball player were dashed by an injury. Instead of wallowing in self-pity, Clint turned his attention to something else: acting. Hollywood didn't exactly roll out the red carpet for Clint. His early career was a far cry from the fame he would later enjoy. He was cast in a variety of roles, often playing minor characters, background players, or nameless faces in films and television shows. It was during this time that he learned the art of perseverance, of staying the course even when it seemed like success was out of reach. His breakthrough came when he was cast as the man with no name in A Fistful of Dollars, 1964, the first of the Dollars trilogy. The role was a game-changer. Clint's portrayal of a lone gunman, indifferent to the chaos around him, struck a chord with audiences. It was the beginning of a new era for Clint, the beginning of his transformation into the quintessential anti-hero. And from there, his career skyrocketed. He starred in a string of successful films, including For a Few Dollars More, The Good, The Bad, and The Ugly, and later, the Dirty Harry series, solidifying his place as a Hollywood icon. But Clint's life wasn't confined to the silver screen. As his fame grew, so did his personal interests in politics and public service. The man who played the tough, unrelenting cop was also a man with a deep sense of duty, a man who believed in serving the greater good. Many people didn't know that Clint had quietly worked with government agencies in various capacities, using his status to assist in causes that mattered to him. Some of his most important work was shrouded in secrecy. He wasn't the kind of person to seek recognition for the work he did behind the scenes. In fact, the truth about Clint's government connections had been hidden from the public for decades. Few people knew that Clint had served as an informal advisor to several U.S. government agencies, using his fame to discreetly influence policy decisions. What many saw as Clint's departure from the big screen into political commentary was actually part of a much larger role he had been playing in the shadows. But it wasn't just about politics. Clint's involvement with the government was far deeper. He had worked on clandestine missions, gathering information, providing intelligence, and participating in covert operations that were never meant to see the light of day. His ties to the United States Secret Service were among the most well-guarded secrets of his life. Over the years, Clint had come to understand that the public persona he had so carefully crafted was not the whole story. As his career grew, so did the demands of his secret life. He had learned to juggle both identities, the famous actor everyone adored and the quiet, determined operative who worked behind the scenes. The duality of Clint Eastwood, one of Hollywood's most enduring stars and a man involved in covert government work, was a reality that few could fully comprehend. And yet, the balance he had struck between the two worlds had allowed him to survive for so long. But now, that world was crashing down around him. The courtroom, once a place of relative calm, was the battleground for Clint's most personal fight yet. His decision to come forward with his USSS badge had been a calculated move, one that would change the course of the trial and reveal the depths of his involvement in a case far more complex than anyone realized. And as the judge looked at Clint in stunned silence, something else was stirring. This wasn't just a battle for Clint's reputation. It was a battle for the truth. The truth about Clint Eastwood, the man behind the mask of the actor. And now, the world would get a glimpse into that truth. As the judge fumbled with his next words, Clint remained calm, the weight of his past, his struggles, his triumphs, his secret life, all hanging in the balance. The legend of Clint Eastwood, it seemed, was only just beginning. But what had started as a mocking courtroom scene was quickly becoming something else entirely, something far more dangerous. And no one, not even Clint himself, knew how it would end. The courtroom was now thick with anticipation. Every person in the room, from the reporters in the back to the attorneys seated at their desks, seemed to be holding their breath. Clint Eastwood, the man who had long been the embodiment of cool, unshakable resolve, had just revealed a secret that no one had expected. His USSS badge lay on the table between him and the judge, a symbol of authority and clandestine work that carried weight beyond the law of Hollywood or the rules of a courtroom. The judge, still recovering from the shock, narrowed his eyes at Clint's calm demeanor. His earlier mockery had now turned into uncertainty, but he couldn't show that. This was his courtroom, after all. His authority was supposed to be absolute. But Clint didn't flinch. His hands, which had placed the badge on the table, remained steady. His gaze, cool and unwavering, was locked on the judge, but his mind was elsewhere, far beyond the sterile walls of the courtroom. He knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't just about winning a case. This wasn't about proving a point to the judge or to the press. It was about something much bigger, and Clint's instinct told him that he had just crossed a line. One that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge began, his voice tinged with forced calm, You are well aware that revealing a badge like this in a public setting is highly irregular. Do you understand the consequences of your actions? Clint didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence hang in the air, letting the tension grow, before slowly leaning forward. The light from the courtroom overhead seemed to highlight the subtle lines in his face, the years of wisdom and the scars of battles, both public and personal, that had shaped him. I do, Clint said, his voice low but carrying authority. But I'm not here to answer your questions. I'm here because I need to clear my name. And this, he gestured to the badge, is part of the reason why. The judge was taken aback, his stern expression faltering for a moment. I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, Mr. Eastwood, but this is not Hollywood. This is a courtroom, and I expect you to act accordingly. Clint's lips curved into the faintest of smirks, a subtle challenge. Maybe it's not Hollywood, he said, eyes glinting with a quiet intensity. But you might want to take a closer look at what's really going on here before you decide how to play this. There was a beat of silence before the judge spoke again, this time with a more measured tone. I don't take kindly to threats, Mr. Eastwood. If you think I'm going to let your celebrity status cloud the proceedings here, you're mistaken. Clint didn't respond. Instead, his eyes flicked toward the gallery of reporters who had been documenting every moment of this exchange. The judge, trying to reassert control, glanced nervously at the jury box, wondering how they were interpreting Clint's actions. The courtroom was beginning to feel more like a battlefield. Meanwhile, Clint's mind was spinning with thoughts of how far this case had spiraled out of his control. He'd come here to fight for his name, to clear the shadow that had been cast over him by the press and the accusations that had been thrown his way. But now, with the reveal of his USSS badge, everything had changed. The room buzzed with whispers. People were trying to make sense of the scene. No one knew what it meant. There had been rumors of Clint's involvement with government agencies before, but nothing concrete. This was different. This wasn't just a rumor. It was proof that Clint Eastwood was far more than the iconic actor everyone knew him to be. He was a man who had lived a life of secrecy, a life with shadows that he had carefully guarded. As the tension in the room mounted, Clint's thoughts drifted to the reason he was here today. The case at hand, at first glance, a straightforward legal matter, was, in fact, much more personal than anyone realized. It wasn't just about a lawsuit. It was about a threat that had hung over him for years. Clint's involvement with the Secret Service hadn't been voluntary. It wasn't a choice he had made lightly. Years ago, after an incident involving his family, Clint had found himself in the middle of a dangerous web of power, corruption, and influence. He had been dragged into a situation far beyond the realm of movie scripts and staged scenes. And now, after years of living with the consequences of those decisions, Clint was finally being forced to confront the truth. He thought back to that night, the night that had changed everything. It had been a quiet evening, a few years prior, when Clint received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was calm, but there was an edge to it. Mr. Eastwood, the voice said, we need your help. It's about your security and your family's safety. We've been tracking a threat. Clint's mind immediately went on high alert. He had always been protective of his family, and he had learned long ago to trust his instincts. The voice continued, explaining how a dangerous group had somehow connected Clint's fame to their own agenda. It wasn't just about money or influence. It was about something more sinister, a vendetta that ran deep. Without hesitation, Clint had agreed to help, but it wasn't as simple as providing information. He had been drawn into a covert operation, one that involved far more than he could have imagined. He was forced to navigate the murky waters of government secrets, working alongside individuals he didn't trust, in situations that were far too risky. And now, years later, that past had caught up with him. The case he was facing today wasn't just a legal battle. It was the result of the very forces that Clint had been forced to confront in his secret life. As Clint's gaze returned to the judge, he knew there was no going back. He had made a choice long ago, one that had placed him in the line of fire, both as a public figure and as someone involved in the hidden world of national security. I've done things that I'm not proud of, Clint said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that no one had anticipated. But I did them because they were necessary. And now, I'm here to face the consequences. The room fell silent once more. The judge, no longer mocking, had no response. And just like that, Clint Eastwood had shifted the narrative. No longer was he just a Hollywood star. He wasn't just a man being dragged through a legal battle. Clint Eastwood was now a figure caught in a web of national intrigue, and the stakes were higher than anyone could have ever imagined. And this, Clint knew, was only the beginning. The air in the courtroom felt thick with suspense, every person present acutely aware that the rules had just changed. Clint Eastwood had never been one to back down from a challenge, but this was no longer a typical legal battle. It had morphed into something much more dangerous, something far beyond his control. As Clint sat in his chair, still facing the judge, his mind continued to race. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him: judges, jurors, lawyers, reporters, and even the bystanders sitting in the gallery. No one knew exactly what to make of his actions, but they all understood one thing. Clint had just raised the stakes to a level none of them had expected. The judge cleared his throat again, trying to regain his composure. "Mr. Eastwood, your behavior in this courtroom is unacceptable. This isn't the time or place for any kind of theatrics. If you have information that you believe is relevant to the case, I suggest you present it through the proper channels. Otherwise, I will have no choice but to hold you in contempt of court." Clint didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, unwavering. He knew the judge's words were an attempt to reassert control, but it wouldn't work. Not anymore. "You don't understand," Clint said softly, but there was an undeniable edge to his voice. "This isn't about the case. It's about something much bigger, something that's been going on for years, hidden from everyone. You're going to find out soon enough that I'm not the only one with secrets." The judge shot him a sharp look, clearly unsettled by the gravity in Clint's voice. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Eastwood?" Clint didn't answer right away. He glanced at the jurors, then back at the judge. "No," he replied, his voice firm but controlled. "I'm not threatening you. I'm giving you a warning. Whatever happens in this courtroom, it's just the beginning. You and everyone here, you're all tangled in something that you don't understand yet." The silence in the room was suffocating. Everyone had been following the trial's proceedings, but now it seemed like they were witnessing something entirely different, something that had nothing to do with the legal charges at hand and everything to do with the dangerous game Clint had found himself in. The judge, clearly rattled, leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Eastwood, you're skating dangerously close to contempt. I'll have you removed if you don't behave." But Clint wasn't intimidated. He had faced much worse than the judge's threat over the years. The real danger wasn't here in the courtroom. It was the unseen forces at play, the forces that had been pulling strings behind the scenes for far too long. His involvement with the Secret Service was not an accident. It was a consequence of a much larger puzzle, and Clint had only recently begun to understand just how deep the rabbit hole went. For years, Clint had kept his involvement with the U.S. government a secret. His role had been well guarded, known only to a select few within the government and the military. He'd been an advisor, a consultant, and in some cases, an active participant in operations that were never meant to be public knowledge. His name had been used to gather intelligence, to manipulate situations, and to ensure that certain actions were taken without anyone ever knowing. It had all started during a dark period in Clint's life, one that had nearly destroyed him. It was nearly a decade ago when the first incident occurred. Clint had been at home one night, preparing for another day of filming, when he received a cryptic message on his secure phone line. The voice on the other end was calm, but there was an urgency behind it. "Clint," the voice said, "you need to listen carefully. There's a threat against your family, against you specifically, and we need to act now." At first, Clint hadn't taken the call seriously. He was used to strange calls, especially given his fame. But the voice continued, outlining details that Clint could never have known. The threats were real, and they were more serious than anyone had anticipated. Within hours, Clint was contacted by a government agency, and his life changed forever. The U.S. Secret Service had been tracking an underground organization, a group with international ties that had begun to target high-profile individuals. Clint's family had become collateral damage in a much larger scheme. He had been drawn into a covert operation to protect himself, his loved ones, and, eventually, the country itself. At first, Clint had resisted. He didn't want to be part of something he didn't understand. He was an actor, not a soldier. But the danger was real. And soon, Clint found himself in over his head. He was asked to use his position and his influence to gather information, to infiltrate circles he would never have dreamed of entering. The agency had learned that Clint's fame could be leveraged in ways no one else could, especially when it came to high-level diplomatic affairs, covert missions, and even military operations. For Clint, it wasn't about seeking out danger. It was about protecting his family and, by extension, his life. But Clint had learned quickly that once you stepped into the world of covert operations, there was no easy way out. The things he had been involved in, the people he had crossed paths with, and the secrets he had uncovered, they had a cost. It was a price that had weighed on him every day since. As Clint sat in the courtroom now, surrounded by an audience that had no idea what was truly at stake, he couldn't help but reflect on the events that had led him here. The trial before him, which seemed like a standard legal matter, was the result of a series of events he had set in motion long ago. It wasn't just a fight to clear his name. It was a fight for his life. And now, as the judge struggled to regain control of the courtroom, Clint knew the true game had only just begun. There were people watching, people who had been pulling the strings for years, and Clint was no longer just an actor or a celebrity. He was a pawn in a far larger battle, one that involved the highest levels of government and international security. It had been years since he had made the decision to take on this secret life, but the consequences were just now beginning to come to light. The courtroom was no longer a place for Clint to clear his name. It was a battleground, a place where power, secrets, and allegiances would collide, and Clint was right in the middle of it. The judge, still flustered, motioned to the attorneys. "Proceed with the trial," he barked, trying to regain his composure. But Clint knew this trial was no longer about the case at hand. It was about survival. And as the next round of questioning began, Clint couldn't help but feel the weight of the decisions he had made, the sacrifices he had endured, and the dangerous game that had only just begun. As the words echoed through the courtroom, Clint knew the final outcome was far from certain. But one thing was clear. This story was far from over. Clint Eastwood had learned long ago that in life, the ground beneath your feet could shift in an instant. One moment, you're at the top of your game, with the world at your feet, and the next, you're in a battle for survival, fighting against unseen forces that are far stronger than you could have imagined. But in that moment, sitting in the courtroom as the walls seemed to close in on him, Clint wasn't thinking about the past. He was thinking about the future. The choices he had made had led him here, and now, it was time to navigate the storm. The judge, clearly still rattled from Clint's earlier revelation, glanced nervously at the attorneys in the room. The tension was palpable. Clint's presence in the courtroom had turned what was supposed to be a routine trial into something much larger, something that no one, not even the judge, was truly prepared for. Every move Clint made, every word he spoke, seemed to send ripples through the room. The reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, their pens flying as they tried to make sense of the unfolding drama. The jury exchanged glances, unsure of what to believe. The atmosphere was thick with uncertainty. The prosecutor, a sharp-minded woman named Kate Stevens, adjusted her glasses and stood up. She was an experienced attorney, one who had faced high-profile cases before, but nothing like this. Clint Eastwood was not just a celebrity. He was a man who had been a part of something far bigger than anyone realized. Kate had spent hours poring over the evidence in this case, and the more she dug, the more she realized that there were layers to this situation. Layers that had nothing to do with the charges on paper. "Mr. Eastwood," she began, her voice measured but carrying an undercurrent of tension. "You've made quite a spectacle of yourself in this courtroom today. I'm sure you're well aware that revealing a Secret Service badge here, in front of the jury, does nothing to help your case." Clint turned his head slowly, meeting her gaze with an expression that betrayed nothing of his true thoughts. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch for a moment, feeling the weight of her words. She was right, in a way. His actions had been bold, risky even, but Clint had never been one to play it safe, especially when the stakes were as high as they were now. "You think I'm playing a game, Miss Stevens," Clint said, his voice quiet but steady. "But this isn't a game. This is real, and you're going to find out just how real it is, whether you like it or not." Kate Stevens raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting such a direct response. She had been trained to handle all kinds of witnesses, but Clint Eastwood wasn't like any other man she had encountered. The man in front of her wasn't just a Hollywood star. He was a man who had seen things that no one could comprehend, a man who had lived through unimaginable situations. And now, he was sitting across from her in a courtroom, his very presence unsettling the carefully constructed facade of the trial. "Mr. Eastwood, your credibility in this courtroom is in question," Kate said, her voice cold and professional. "And I will not allow you to undermine this process." Clint could sense the growing tension. The prosecutor wasn't just trying to win the case. She was trying to control the narrative, to rein in a man who had disrupted everything. But Clint wasn't interested in playing by her rules. He had lived his life on his own terms, and now, more than ever, he needed to do whatever it took to uncover the truth. "Then let's stop pretending, Miss Stevens," Clint replied, his voice now tinged with frustration. "This case, this trial, it's just a distraction. It's all smoke and mirrors. The truth is much more complicated than any of us are willing to admit. You know it, and I know it." The room fell into a heavy silence. For a moment, even the reporters seemed to pause, their pens still. The judge glanced at Clint, his expression unreadable. He had been trying to regain control, but Clint wasn't making it easy. This wasn't just about one man in a courtroom anymore. This was about a larger, darker conspiracy that no one was prepared to face. Kate Stevens took a deep breath and looked down at the evidence in front of her, a fleeting moment of doubt crossing her face. She had always prided herself on her ability to win cases, on her ability to control the narrative. But Clint's words had struck a nerve. He was right about one thing. This trial was only the surface. Beneath it, there was something far more dangerous lurking, and Clint had just pulled the veil back, whether anyone was ready for it or not. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge interjected, his voice shaking slightly, "I've warned you before. If you continue to derail this trial, I will have no choice but to hold you in contempt." Clint met the judge's gaze, his face impassive. "Do what you have to do," he said softly, "but I'm not leaving until I've said what needs to be said." The judge paused, as if weighing his options. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, but for a moment, he was powerless. Clint had not just challenged the court's authority. He had exposed a vulnerability, a weakness in the system that no one could ignore. "Very well," the judge said, after a long moment. "Proceed, but you will not use this courtroom as a platform for anything other than the matter at hand." Clint nodded slightly, then turned his attention back to the prosecutor. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him, but there was a sense of determination within him that would not be swayed. This was no longer about clearing his name or winning a legal battle. It was about survival, about exposing the truth. He glanced at the jury, noticing how some of them had shifted in their seats. They were starting to see the cracks in the facade. Some were whispering among themselves, exchanging uncertain glances. The trial had taken a turn, and it was clear that they were no longer sure what to believe. Clint could feel it in the air, the beginning of a storm. The walls were closing in, but Clint Eastwood wasn't about to back down. Whatever secrets lay hidden in the shadows, he was going to uncover them, no matter what it took. And so, as the trial continued, Clint began to brace himself for what would come next. The game had changed, and he was prepared to play it by his own rules. The storm was coming, and Clint Eastwood was ready. The tension in the courtroom had reached a level that was almost palpable. Every person, whether they were sitting in the gallery or at the bench, felt the unease that had settled into the room. Clint Eastwood, as ever, sat at the center of it all, his face unreadable, but his mind racing with thoughts of the storm he was about to unleash. Kate Stevens, the prosecutor, had tried to regain control of the proceedings, but Clint's sudden defiance had left her shaken. He wasn't just a defendant anymore. He was a man who had secrets, secrets that were too dangerous to ignore. And as Clint looked across the room at the jury, he saw that they too were beginning to sense the gravity of the situation. This trial was no longer about a simple case. It was about much more. As the courtroom settled back into a tense silence, the judge banged his gavel again, his hand slightly trembling. "Mr. Eastwood, you've made your point, but I will remind you that this is a court of law, not a platform for you to air grievances unrelated to the matter at hand," he said, his voice tinged with irritation. Clint didn't respond immediately, instead allowing the weight of the judge's words to hang in the air. But in his mind, he was already several steps ahead. He had known that once he revealed the truth about his connection to the U.S. Secret Service, the courtroom, and possibly the world, would be turned upside down. But there was no turning back now. He had already made his decision, and the consequences were beginning to unfold. The prosecutor, Kate Stevens, took a deep breath and looked down at her notes, trying to compose herself. She had been thrown off balance, but she was still a skilled attorney, and she wasn't going to let Clint's theatrics derail her strategy. "Your Honor," Kate said, standing up and addressing the judge, "I request that we continue with the case. This court has a duty to focus on the charges, not on unrelated matters that Mr. Eastwood seems intent on dragging into this trial." The judge nodded slowly, his gaze flickering between Clint and Kate. "Proceed, Miss Stevens," he said, his voice firm, though still tinged with uncertainty. Kate Stevens turned to Clint, her eyes narrowing. She was a professional, and she had dealt with plenty of celebrities before, but Clint was different. He was a man who seemed to have a purpose far beyond the legal charges against him, and she was beginning to wonder just how deep the rabbit hole went. "Mr. Eastwood," she began, her tone sharp but calculated, "you've made it clear that you're not here to fight the charges in a traditional manner. But let's be clear, this court is not interested in your connections to the Secret Service or your personal history. We're here to address the legal matter at hand." Clint leaned forward, meeting her gaze with a cold, steady stare. "You don't get it, do you, Miss Stevens?" he said, his voice low and calm. "This is the matter at hand. This isn't just about the case. It's about everything that led up to it. The people, the power, the secrets that are buried beneath everything you think you know." The prosecutor's lips tightened in frustration, but she knew that Clint was right in one regard. This trial was not just about the charges on the surface. It was about something much darker, something that had been lurking beneath the surface for years. And Clint was the key to uncovering it all. "We'll see about that, Mr. Eastwood," Kate said, her eyes flickering with a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. "But I'll warn you, this courtroom is not the place for your personal vendettas." Clint didn't flinch. He knew the stakes. It's not a vendetta. It's the truth. And you'll see it, whether you want to or not. Kate paused, looking down at her notes, as if trying to regain her composure. She had always prided herself on being able to control the narrative in her cases, but Clint was slipping through her fingers. He wasn't playing by the rules, and that made him a dangerous adversary. But as much as Clint's words rattled her, it was the truth that haunted her. She couldn't help but wonder, how much of Clint's past had been hidden from the public? And what was it that he was trying to expose? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that there were pieces of this puzzle that she didn't understand. Later that evening, Clint sat alone in his hotel room, the weight of the day's events pressing down on him. His mind wandered back to the moment when everything had changed, the moment when he had been pulled into the world of government secrets, a world where nothing was as it seemed. It had all started with a simple phone call. At the time, Clint had been at the height of his career, filming one of his most successful movies. He had just finished shooting a scene when his secure line rang. He had answered it on instinct, never imagining that the voice on the other end would forever alter the course of his life. "Clint," the voice had said, low and urgent, "we need your help." The voice belonged to a man he had met only once before, an agent with the Secret Service who had briefed Clint on some sensitive matters in the past. But this time, the urgency in the voice was unmistakable. "There's a threat against you, Clint," the agent had said, "against your family, and there's only one way to stop it." At first, Clint had dismissed the call as another round of government paranoia. But then the agent had told him things that only Clint would know, specific details about his life, his family, his routine. It was then that Clint realized this wasn't a hoax. It wasn't just some random threat. It was real. Within hours, Clint had been pulled into a covert operation, working alongside federal agents and intelligence officials. What began as a simple threat against his life quickly spiraled into something much more dangerous. He was forced to navigate a shadow world of government agents, secret deals, and covert missions, things he had never signed up for. And as the months wore on, Clint began to realize that his role was far bigger than anyone had initially let on. He was being used, no, manipulated, into something he didn't fully understand. As Clint thought back on it now, he felt a pang of regret. He had made the decision to protect his family, but in doing so, he had walked into a labyrinth of lies and deceit. He had been dragged into a game where the stakes were higher than he ever could have imagined. And now, sitting in his hotel room, Clint understood that the game was far from over. The revelation of his connection to the U.S. Secret Service had only just begun to unravel the web of secrets he had spent years trying to protect. And with every passing minute, the walls were closing in tighter around him. He had made the choice to expose the truth, but now that he had, there was no going back. Tomorrow, he would have to face the consequences. And the clock was ticking. The following morning, Clint Eastwood stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at his reflection. The familiar lines on his face had become deeper over the years, but today, they seemed more pronounced. There was no mistaking it. Things were changing, and not for the better. The revelations of the previous day had rattled him. When he had flashed the Secret Service badge in court, he hadn't just stunned the people in the room. He had opened a door that was now impossible to close. The truth about his past, about the government's involvement in his life, was out in the open, and there was no telling where it would lead. Clint rubbed his jaw, his thoughts swirling. He knew the danger he was in. Once a secret was exposed, it became a weapon. And now that weapon was aimed squarely at him. There was a knock at the door, and Clint's gut twisted. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face anyone just yet, but he knew that ignoring the outside world wasn't an option. He opened the door to find his lawyer, Michael Dawson, standing in the hallway. Michael was a seasoned professional, a man Clint had trusted for years, but even his calm demeanor couldn't mask the unease in his eyes. "Clint," Michael said, stepping inside, "we need to talk." Clint nodded, not saying anything, and led Michael into the small sitting area of his suite. He had grown used to high-stakes situations, but this was different. This wasn't about a movie set or a role he was playing. This was real, and it was spiraling out of control. "What's the latest?" Clint asked, his voice tight with tension. Michael hesitated, taking a moment before answering. "The prosecution's making moves. They're calling in extra witnesses, ones we weren't prepared for. And the media's already spinning the story. You're no longer just a defendant, Clint. You're a target." Clint exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud was a cold reality check. What's their angle? What's the next step? "They're looking for anything they can use to discredit you. Anything they can twist into a scandal," Michael said. "You've got to be careful with what you say from here on out. Yesterday's stunt with the badge? That's only going to fuel their narrative." Clint clenched his jaw. "I didn't do that for show. I did it because it's the truth. This case, it's bigger than anything they're telling you." Michael sighed, his expression weary. "I know, Clint, but we need to play this carefully. The Secret Service, that's not something you can just throw out in the open without consequences. People are going to want answers, and some of them won't be friendly." Clint's eyes narrowed. "I didn't come this far to back down now." "I'm not saying you should," Michael replied, his voice firm, "but we need to be strategic. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about everyone involved in this, and the people who are pulling the strings behind the scenes." Clint stared at him, processing the weight of his words. He knew Michael was right. The game had changed. The stakes were higher than ever, and Clint could already feel the pressure building. There was no way he was going to walk away from this. Not now, but he had to be careful. One wrong move, and it could all come crashing down. By midday, Clint found himself back in the courtroom, facing a crowd that seemed even more intense than the day before. Word of his revelation had spread like wildfire, and as Clint entered the room, he could feel the eyes of the reporters on him, the weight of their gaze heavy and judging. The judge, visibly agitated, took his seat, his gavel banging sharply against the desk. "Mr. Eastwood," he began, his voice stern, I trust you understand the seriousness of your actions yesterday. This courtroom is not a platform for your personal vendettas or public displays. You will proceed in a manner befitting the respect of this court, or you will be held in contempt. Clint met the judge's eyes with a steely resolve. He wasn't here to make friends or please anyone. He was here to seek justice, to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. I understand, Clint said, his voice quiet but forceful. The judge gave a curt nod, then turned his attention to the prosecution. Ms. Stevens, proceed. Kate Stevens stood, her expression unreadable. She had clearly prepared for this moment, for the fallout of Clint's revelations, but it was hard to deny that there was a hint of uncertainty in her demeanor. The case had taken a dangerous turn, and the prosecutor had yet to figure out how to respond to the sudden shift in dynamics. We will continue, Kate said, her tone measured but sharp. But make no mistake, Mr. Eastwood's actions will be taken into account when determining his credibility. Clint's lawyer, Michael Dawson, stood to his feet. Your Honor, the defense maintains that the defendant's actions yesterday were not done with the intent to disrupt these proceedings. Mr. Eastwood's relationship with the Secret Service is a matter of national security and not irrelevant to the case at hand. Mr. Dawson, the judge interrupted, raising a hand. You will refrain from turning this courtroom into a circus. We are here to focus on the charges, not on unrelated matters. Clint's gaze hardened as he looked at the judge. He had been in enough high-stakes situations to know when things were spiraling out of control, but there was nothing he could do now. He had already opened the door, and there was no shutting it. Kate Stevens addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard what the defense claims. But let me remind you, this trial is about Mr. Eastwood's actions. The question is not about who he knows or what secrets he may hold, but about the criminal actions he stands accused of. Clint's mind raced as he listened to Kate's words. The jury was listening closely, and he could feel their judgment weighing on him. This wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about something far more important. And Clint knew that if he didn't make the right move now, it could cost him everything. As the trial continued, Clint's thoughts drifted back to the day he had been first approached by the U.S. Secret Service. The shadows of his past were closing in on him, and he knew that whatever came next, he had to stay one step ahead. The truth was dangerous, but Clint had never been afraid of danger. Later that afternoon, as the court session recessed, Clint walked out into the hallway, his thoughts consumed by the weight of what was to come. His lawyer followed closely behind, but before they could speak, a familiar face appeared in front of them. It was Detective Jack Rivers, a man Clint had worked with on several cases in the past. Jack's face was grim as he stepped closer to Clint. You're not going to like this, Jack said, his voice low and urgent. I've got news. There's more to this than you know. Much more. Clint's pulse quickened. He had suspected as much. What is it? Clint asked, his voice tense. Jack glanced around, making sure no one was listening, then leaned in closer. They're after you, Clint. But they're not the only ones. There are others, people with much more power, pulling the strings behind all of this. This trial? It's just a distraction. Clint's heart raced. He had known this was bigger than it seemed, but hearing it out loud made the reality hit him like a punch to the gut. Who? Clint asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack looked around once more before speaking again. The people you've crossed, and the people who are trying to keep you quiet. Clint's mind spun as the world around him seemed to narrow. It was no longer just about clearing his name. The stakes had become something far more dangerous, and Clint Eastwood was about to learn just how far they were willing to go to keep him silent. The air in the hallway felt thicker than it had moments before. Clint's pulse was racing, and his thoughts were already moving faster than he could keep up with. The casual demeanor he usually carried around with him felt like a distant memory. Now, with Detective Jack Rivers standing before him, everything had changed. Clint's world was suddenly full of shadows, people pulling strings from behind the curtain, whispers of a deeper conspiracy, and a truth he was only beginning to understand. He'd always thought of himself as a man who could navigate the maze of Hollywood and politics, but now he realized that what was happening to him wasn't a game. It was real, and it was dangerous. Jack glanced over his shoulder one more time, ensuring no one was nearby, before continuing in a hushed tone, "Clint, I don't know how deep this goes, but I know one thing for sure. They're not done with you. You think it's just about this case, but trust me, it's much bigger. There's something they're hiding, and you're in the way." Clint's brow furrowed. "Who's behind this, Jack? And why target me? I didn't sign up for any of this." Jack sighed, stepping closer. "You remember the operation you were involved with? The one you thought you'd walked away from? That's the key. They didn't just let you walk away. They used you, Clint. And now they're coming to collect." Clint felt a chill run through him. The operation had been years ago, and at the time, it had seemed like a one-off mission, something he'd been roped into by circumstance. But Jack's words hit him like a slap. "They used me." He had always assumed his past was something he could control, a chapter that he had closed. But now he realized he was still living within that chapter, and the pages were turning faster than he could handle. "I thought it was just a one-time thing. They needed someone with my profile," Clint said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "It wasn't supposed to be this." Jack shook his head. "You weren't just someone with a profile, Clint. You were a tool. They needed someone they could trust, someone with your position, your visibility. And now you're not just a witness anymore. You're part of a bigger picture. They've been watching you for years." Clint could feel his chest tighten. "Who are they, Jack? Who are these people?" "I don't know for sure, but I do know they're well-connected, powerful, and not afraid to do whatever it takes to keep their secrets safe." Jack's face grew darker as he spoke. "What you revealed in court yesterday, that wasn't just a badge. That was a signal. They know you've got something on them, and they're not going to let you go without a fight." Clint leaned back against the wall, trying to make sense of everything. His thoughts swirled as the pieces of his past began to fit together, but they didn't make the picture clearer. They made it more complicated. "Is it over then?" Clint asked, his voice barely audible. "Is there a way out of this?" Jack looked him dead in the eye, a mix of determination and concern in his gaze. "I don't know, but you're not alone in this, Clint. I've got your back, but you need to be careful. The next move is theirs, and they'll come after you harder than ever. If they can't control you, they'll destroy you." Clint felt his stomach churn at the thought. Who else knows about all this? "Not many," Jack replied. "But there are a few good people left. People who still believe in what the Secret Service stands for. People who aren't involved in whatever dark agenda is unfolding. You need to find them. Fast." Clint nodded slowly, processing the gravity of Jack's words. His mind raced as he considered his next steps. If there were people out there who could help him, he needed to find them before the wrong people did. But Clint knew that finding the truth now wouldn't be as simple as following the law. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about survival. "Where do I start?" Clint asked, his voice determined. Jack didn't answer immediately. He glanced around one more time, ensuring they were alone, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "Here's a contact. Someone you can trust. They'll know how to get you where you need to go." Clint took the envelope, his fingers brushing against Jack's, and held it tightly. "Thanks," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "I won't forget this." Jack nodded, his expression grave. "I hope you don't have to. And Clint, don't trust anyone who's already been in this game for too long. There are eyes everywhere." With that, Jack turned and disappeared down the hallway, leaving Clint alone with the envelope that held the key to everything. Clint stood there for a moment, staring at the small piece of paper in his hand, knowing that this was the beginning of a new phase in his life, one that would be more dangerous than anything he had ever faced before. Later that evening, Clint sat in his hotel room, carefully inspecting the contents of the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper with a name and a phone number. No other information, no instructions. Just a contact, someone who could help him unravel the mess he'd found himself in. He sat back in his chair, staring at the number, contemplating the next move. For a moment, he thought about calling the number immediately, reaching out and diving headfirst into whatever awaited him on the other side. But a part of him hesitated. Trusting someone wasn't easy, especially when the stakes were this high. The sound of a knock at the door broke Clint's concentration. His hand instinctively reached for the gun he kept hidden in the drawer, a reflex born from years of living in a world full of threats. He stood up slowly, moving cautiously toward the door. Through the peephole, he saw no one. Only a small, unmarked package on the floor. Clint's heart raced as he stepped back, his mind whirling. Was this part of the game? Who had left it? He opened the door, careful not to make a sound, and retrieved the package. It was light, almost empty, and when he shook it, it made a soft, rattling sound. Clint opened the package cautiously, revealing a small device inside. It looked like a tracker, a piece of tech he recognized all too well from his time working in covert operations. This wasn't just a message. This was a warning. Clint stared at the tracker, his jaw tightening. He had been right. They were coming for him, and they were already one step ahead. The package, small and seemingly insignificant, sat in Clint's palm. He studied it carefully, his mind trying to make sense of the implications. A tracker. It was a simple piece of technology, but in the wrong hands, it could be devastating. Clint had been in enough high-risk situations to recognize the tool for what it was. It wasn't just a way to follow someone. It was a way to control them, to always know where they were. His first instinct was to get rid of it, but there was something unsettling about the way it had been delivered. No note, no warning, just this piece of high-tech equipment. Whoever was behind this knew how to get to him, knew how to make him feel hunted. Clint walked over to the desk and placed the tracker next to the small lamp. He stared at it for a long moment, his mind working through the possibilities. Whoever had sent this wasn't just trying to scare him. They were trying to send a message. And Clint knew, deep down, that it wasn't just a warning about being watched. It was a message that said, "You can't run." He stood up abruptly and moved to the window, his eyes scanning the street below. His instincts told him to leave, to disappear before it was too late. But where could he go? Who could he trust? The knock on the door came suddenly, interrupting his thoughts. Clint froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't expecting anyone. He glanced back at the package on the desk, then moved to the door with cautious steps. He reached for the handle, his breath held. He opened the door to find Michael Dawson standing there, looking more serious than Clint had ever seen him. Michael wasn't the type to show his emotions easily, but now there was a definite edge to him. "Clint, we need to talk," Michael said, his voice low and urgent. Clint's gut twisted. About what? Michael stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Clint. "About what's going on. About the people who are targeting you." Clint's pulse quickened. "How do you know?" Michael's eyes darkened. "Because they're after me, too." Clint blinked, trying to process the weight of those words. "What do you mean? They're after you?" Michael's face tightened. "After everything that happened yesterday, after what you did in court, I've become a liability. They don't care who gets hurt in the process. They want to shut this down, Clint. And they don't care who they have to silence." Clint's mind raced. "So, what does that mean for me?" "It means," Michael said, "we're both in danger. I've been getting threats, calls from numbers I don't recognize. And someone left a package for me this morning, just like the one you got." Clint's stomach sank. He picked up the tracker from the desk and held it out. "You mean this?" Michael's eyes widened. "Exactly like that. But I don't think it's just a coincidence. We're being watched, Clint, and they want us to know it." Clint's hand tightened around the device. "I don't know what game they're playing, but they're not going to win. We need to find out who's behind this, and we need to do it fast." Michael nodded. "I've been talking to some people, some contacts in the government. I've got a friend who works for a private security firm. I think he might be able to help us, if we can get to him before they do." Clint's mind snapped into focus. "How do we get to him?" Michael hesitated for a moment, glancing around the room as if to make sure no one was listening. "We meet him at a location. I'll send you the details, but we have to act fast. This isn't just about us anymore. Whoever's behind this, they've got resources. They've got people in places we never thought we'd have to worry about." Clint's gaze hardened. "I don't care who they are or what they think they can do. We're not backing down." Michael looked at him with a mix of respect and concern. "I know you're not, but we need to be smart about this. The more we push, the more we risk. These people, whoever they are, they won't hesitate to destroy anyone in their way." Clint turned away from the window, his thoughts now completely focused. "We don't have time for hesitation. If we wait, we're dead. We go now. Michael looked at Clint, then nodded. All right, I'll get the details to you. But stay low, Clint. Don't make any moves without me. We'll take care of this together. Clint watched Michael leave the room, then turned back to the window, his eyes narrowing as he looked out over the city. He knew this was just the beginning. They were going to find out who was behind all of this, and he was going to make them regret ever crossing him. That night, Clint didn't sleep. Every sound outside the hotel room seemed amplified. Every shadow felt like it was hiding someone watching him. He sat at the desk, turning the tracker over in his hand, trying to figure out how to use it to his advantage. But as the hours passed, something in his gut told him that it wasn't just the tracker he needed to worry about. There was something bigger, something deeper, that was controlling the game. Whoever was behind the attacks on him, on Michael, had their hands in everything. The truth was out there, but it was tangled in a web of lies, secrets, and deception that Clint wasn't sure he could untangle on his own. His phone buzzed with a new message, jolting him from his thoughts. It was from Michael. Meet me at the old warehouse on Oak Street at midnight. Come alone. Clint didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket and checked the firearm he kept tucked in his waistband. There was no room for mistakes. No time for second thoughts. The night was darker than usual as Clint made his way to the warehouse. The streets were eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the sound of his footsteps echoing off the pavement. As he approached the warehouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but he ignored it. There was no turning back now. The warehouse loomed ahead, its windows boarded up, its doors shut tight. Clint pushed open the rusted metal door, the creaking sound reverberating in the night air. Inside, the darkness was complete, but Clint's eyes quickly adjusted. He could see a figure standing in the far corner of the room, the outline of a person waiting for him. Michael's contact. Clint moved forward, but before he could reach the figure, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He wasn't alone. He spun around, his hand reaching for his gun. A voice rang out from the shadows. You're too late, Clint. Clint froze, his grip tightening around the weapon. He knew that voice, and it sent a chill through his veins. The figure stepped forward from the shadows, a familiar face emerging from the darkness. Clint's heart dropped into his stomach as recognition hit him like a punch to the gut. Tommy? Clint's voice came out in a hoarse whisper, disbelief flooding his mind. Tommy Grant was someone Clint had known for years. They had served together in various high-risk operations back in the day. Tommy had always been the one to keep things light, cracking jokes during their most dangerous missions. But this was something else entirely. Tommy's face, once warm and friendly, was now cold, his expression unreadable. His eyes, which had once reflected the same trust Clint had shared, were now hard, calculating. He was wearing a dark jacket, his hands tucked into his pockets as he studied Clint with a look that sent a shiver down his spine. You're too late, Clint, Tommy repeated, his tone flat. They've already made their move. Clint's mind raced, his thoughts jumbled with confusion and anger. What the hell are you talking about? He demanded, stepping toward Tommy, his gun still drawn. You're with them, aren't you? Tommy didn't flinch. He stood there, unbothered by Clint's accusatory tone. Not with them, Clint. I'm against you. I never wanted to be involved, but it's too late for that now. You should have stayed out of this, but now, well, now I have no choice. Clint took a step back, his mind trying to piece together the situation. You were always a good guy, Tommy. What happened? Tommy let out a bitter laugh. A good guy? You've got it all wrong. You think just because we shared a few beers and some laughs on missions, that means we're friends? That doesn't mean anything in this world. People will sell you out for a lot less than the right price. And that's exactly what I did. Clint's grip on his gun tightened. You sold me out? Tommy nodded slowly, his face betraying no emotion. I didn't want to, but when they offered me a way out, I took it. What they've promised me, power, money, security, it's too much to ignore. You wouldn't understand. You're stuck in your righteous little world, but out here, it's survival of the fittest. And I chose to survive. Clint's thoughts were spinning. Betrayal. It was something Clint had faced before in his life, but never from someone like Tommy. someone who had been his partner, his ally in the field. "You don't know what you're doing, Tommy," Clint said, his voice low and steady, despite the rage rising within him. "These people you're working with, they'll throw you away the second they're done with you. You think they'll keep their promises?" Tommy's eyes flickered for a brief moment, a hint of doubt flashing across his face before he masked it. "Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But at least I have a shot at something more than just being a pawn. You're the one who's blind to the reality, Clint. You're playing a game you can't win." Clint took another step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "I don't care about their promises. I care about the truth. I care about stopping them before they do something worse. If you're smart, Tommy, you'll walk away from this. You'll help me take them down." Tommy's face hardened. "It's too late for that, Clint. I made my choice. And you made yours. You're not getting out of this. None of us are." Clint's blood ran cold. The weight of Tommy's words hit him harder than any physical blow could. He had known Tommy for years, trusted him with his life. But now he was the enemy, one of the people standing in the way of everything Clint was trying to uncover. Before Clint could react, the sound of footsteps echoed in the warehouse. Several more figures emerged from the shadows, all wearing dark, nondescript clothing. The tension in the air thickened as Clint realized that this wasn't just a confrontation between old friends. It was an ambush. "Who are they?" Clint asked, his eyes scanning the newcomers. Tommy gave a grim smile. "You don't need to know. All you need to know is that they're going to make sure you don't make it out of here." Clint's grip on his gun tightened, but he knew he couldn't take on a whole team by himself. He was surrounded, outnumbered, and no matter how skilled he was, this wasn't a fight he could win. Not like this. "Put the gun down, Clint," Tommy said, his voice calm but firm. "There's no point in fighting." Clint's mind raced, thinking fast. He wasn't ready to surrender. He couldn't. Not yet. He needed more time, more answers, and most importantly, he needed to get out of here alive. "No," Clint replied, his voice colder than he intended. "I'm not done yet." The tension in the room was palpable. The figures surrounding Clint remained motionless, watching him like predators waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Tommy's expression softened for a fraction of a second, as if he regretted what was about to happen, but it was gone before Clint could fully read it. "You never understood, Clint," Tommy said quietly. "This is bigger than us. You could have been a part of it, but now you're just a liability." Clint's mind was working in overdrive. He needed to make a decision, and fast. One thing was clear. The people in front of him weren't interested in talking. They had a plan, and it didn't include him walking away. Clint made his move. In one fluid motion, he dropped to the ground, rolling to the side, using the cover of darkness to his advantage. Gunfire erupted, but he was already on the move, darting toward the back of the warehouse. "Move, move, move," Tommy shouted, but Clint was already gone, weaving through the rows of stacked crates and machinery. His heart pounded in his chest as he ran. Every instinct screamed at him to keep going, to get out of here while he still could. He knew that if he didn't find a way out soon, he wouldn't make it through the night. He heard footsteps behind him, closing in. His breath came in short bursts, his mind focused solely on escaping, on survival. He wasn't going to let Tommy's betrayal be the end of him. Not like this. Clint burst through a side door and into the alley behind the warehouse, the cool night air hitting his face. He didn't stop to look behind him, didn't waste a second to check if anyone was still following. All that mattered was getting out, finding Michael, and figuring out his next move. As Clint ran into the night, his thoughts were clearer than ever. There was no turning back now. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for the truth. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint's heart was still pounding in his chest as he sprinted through the dark alley, his mind reeling from what had just transpired. Tommy's betrayal had shaken him more than he was willing to admit, and the fact that he had just barely escaped from a deadly ambush sent a clear message. The stakes were higher than he had anticipated. He didn't stop to catch his breath until he reached the end of the alley, where a narrow street met the main road. He quickly glanced over his shoulder, making sure no one had followed him out, before taking a sharp turn onto the busy street. His instincts told him that the danger wasn't over yet, that they'd be looking for him. He couldn't afford to be reckless. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, blending in with the passing pedestrians, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd for any sign of trouble. The city was alive with noise, lights, and movement, but Clint felt a heavy sense of isolation, as if he were standing in the eye of a storm, waiting for the next wave of chaos to hit. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Clint pulled it out quickly, his fingers trembling slightly as he checked the message. "Michael, where are you?" The warehouse was a trap. "Meet me at the old diner on 5th. We need to talk. Now." Clint cursed under his breath. The last thing he wanted to do was meet up with anyone, but he knew he had no choice. Michael was the one person who still had his back, and if they were going to figure out who was behind this, they needed to work together. Clint hailed a cab and instructed the driver to take him to the diner. The streets blurred past him as his thoughts raced. Tommy's betrayal stung, but it was more than just a personal wound. It meant that they were up against something far more organized than Clint had ever realized. This wasn't just a rogue group trying to take him down. This was a well-coordinated effort, and that made them dangerous. The cab pulled up to the diner, an old-fashioned greasy spoon with flickering neon lights. It was the kind of place no one noticed unless they were looking for something, or someone. Clint scanned the parking lot as he got out, his eyes darting over every car parked in the lot. When he didn't see anything suspicious, he walked toward the entrance, his hand resting on the gun at his side, just in case. Inside, the diner was nearly empty, save for a lone waitress behind the counter and a couple of people sitting at the booths. Clint spotted Michael immediately, sitting at a corner booth, his back to the wall, eyes scanning the room with the kind of vigilance Clint had come to expect from him. Clint slid into the booth across from Michael, glancing around one last time to make sure they weren't being watched. "Is it safe?" Clint asked in a low voice, keeping his tone casual despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. Michael nodded, his expression tense. "Yeah, I've been here for a while. No one's followed you, at least not yet." Clint leaned back in the booth, his fingers tapping on the table as he considered the situation. "Tommy's working for them. I'm sure of it now. He's the one who set me up at the warehouse." Michael's jaw tightened. "I figured as much. The way he acted in the courtroom, the way he's been moving, it wasn't just about us anymore. He made a choice, and now we have to deal with it." Clint's eyes narrowed. "I'm not letting him off the hook. We find out who's pulling his strings, and we make sure this doesn't go any further." Michael didn't respond right away. He picked up his coffee cup and took a long sip, his brow furrowed. "I know you want to take him down, but it's bigger than just him, Clint. Whoever's behind this has resources, connections, people in places we don't even know about. We can't take them on like we would any other enemy." Clint's grip on the table tightened. "So, what do we do? Wait around and hope they get bored of hunting us?" Michael shook his head. "We don't wait, but we need a plan. And we need to get smarter about this. We have to think bigger. If we're going to stop this, we have to figure out who else is involved. Who else is working against us?" Clint rubbed his forehead, trying to sort through his thoughts. Michael was right. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something far more complicated, something dangerous. "I've been thinking," Michael continued. "I have a contact in a government intelligence agency. I've reached out to him. He's willing to help, but only if we can get him the right information. He's got people inside that can get us access to the intelligence we need. But we have to be careful. We can't let anyone know we're involved." Clint's eyebrows furrowed. "We go to someone like that, and we're going to be on their radar. There's no way we walk away from this without attracting attention." "I know," Michael said quietly, "but we don't have many other options. The clock's ticking, and if we don't move soon, we're going to be dead in the water. We need to play this strategically. No more blind moves." Clint exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation pressing on him. He didn't like the idea of relying on someone else, especially someone in the government. But Michael was right. They needed help, and they needed it fast. "I don't trust anyone," Clint muttered, his voice low. "But I trust you. If this guy can help us get to the bottom of all this, then we don't have a choice." Michael nodded. "I'll set up a meeting. We're going to need everything we can get." They sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of their next steps hanging over them. Clint knew this wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about taking down an entire network of people who were willing to destroy lives to get what they wanted. And Clint would make sure they paid for what they had done. Hours later, Clint stood at the edge of a quiet park, staring at the streetlight that illuminated the area ahead of him. Michael had given him the time and place for the meeting with the contact, and now it was time to put their plan into motion. Clint wasn't sure what to expect, but he was ready. Whoever this contact was, they were either going to be an ally in the fight, or someone else who could be bought off by the people after Clint. But Clint had no choice. He had to trust that Michael knew what he was doing. As Clint waited, he kept his guard up, scanning the area for any sign of danger. The silence of the park seemed unnatural, too still for his liking. Then, a figure appeared from the shadows. Clint's hand instinctively went to his sidearm, but the figure spoke first. Clint Eastwood. The voice was low, calm, and clipped, but it carried an undeniable authority. Clint straightened up. "Who are you?" The figure stepped forward, revealing a man in a dark suit. His face was sharp, his eyes calculating, and Clint immediately felt that he was in the presence of someone who knew how to play the game. "Name's Carter," the man said, offering a hand. "I hear you're looking for answers." Clint didn't shake Carter's hand right away. He wasn't in the business of trusting strangers, especially ones who appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the night. But there was something about Carter's calm demeanor that made Clint pause. This wasn't an ordinary contact. There was a sense of power around him, an aura that Clint couldn't ignore. "I'm listening," Clint said cautiously, not budging from his spot. He kept his hand near the gun at his side, though he didn't draw it. "Not yet." Carter studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I'm not here to waste your time. You want answers, and I can provide them. But it's not going to be easy. In fact, it'll cost you." Clint raised an eyebrow. "How much is it going to cost me?" Carter's lips twisted into a slight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That depends. What are you willing to give me?" Clint didn't answer right away. He thought about it, about everything that had brought him here. He had no choice but to work with people like Carter, people who had access to information Clint didn't. But that didn't mean he had to like it. "I'm not in the habit of making deals with people I don't trust," Clint said finally, his voice steady but cold. "You want me to play your game, Carter? You'd better make it worth my while." Carter nodded slowly, as if Clint's words were expected. "Fair enough. Here's what I can do for you. I have access to certain classified files, people within the system who can provide the intel you need. In exchange, I need a favor." Clint's gaze sharpened. "A favor? What kind of favor?" "Nothing you can't handle," Carter replied. "I need you to retrieve something for me. Something that's out of reach for most people. And I don't just mean the police or the authorities. I mean anyone with half a brain would be too scared to try." Clint's eyes narrowed. "You want me to steal something?" Carter didn't flinch. "Not steal. Retrieve. There's a difference. I'm not asking you to break any laws, Clint. I'm asking you to do what you're good at. Get the job done. And I'll provide you with everything you need to take down the people who've been playing you." Clint exhaled sharply, thinking it over. He wasn't thrilled about the idea of doing favors for people like Carter, but he knew the stakes. He was already knee-deep in this, and the only way out was to get the answers he needed. He couldn't do that without help. "All right," Clint said after a long pause, his voice hard. "What do you need me to get?" Carter's gaze flickered with a hint of satisfaction, but he quickly masked it. He pulled out a small tablet from his jacket pocket and handed it to Clint. "Take a look," Carter said. "That's the place you're going to. It's a secure location, heavily guarded. Inside, there's a server room. I need you to grab a specific file from there. It's encrypted, but you'll be able to break through it if you know what you're doing." Clint took the tablet and studied the map that appeared on the screen. His sharp eyes traced the layout of a high-tech facility, marked with security checkpoints, armed guards, and more than a few locked doors. "Why don't you do it yourself?" Clint asked, skepticism dripping from his words. "You've got all the intel, Carter. Why send me?" Carter's expression darkened, but his tone remained smooth. "Because I don't have the same freedom of movement that you do. You're not bound by the same restrictions. I'm sure you've noticed by now that there are certain people who would love nothing more than to see me locked up in a cell for the rest of my life. I'm not in the business of making myself vulnerable." Clint nodded, understanding the unspoken part of the equation. Carter was a player in the shadows, and the last thing he wanted was to be exposed to the same forces that Clint was trying to bring down. "Fine," Clint said, pocketing the tablet, "but I'm not doing this out of the goodness of my heart. You better come through with the info you promised." Carter's smile returned, but it was more predatory now. "You'll get what you need, Clint. Just make sure you don't make a mess of this." With that, Carter turned and started to walk away. Clint hesitated for a moment, then followed him, not sure what to expect next. "You'll be in touch?" Clint called after him. Carter paused, turning back with a sly grin. "You'll know when the time comes." Then, he disappeared into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as he had arrived. Clint stood there for a moment, processing everything. The plan was risky, but it was his only option. If he could pull this off, if he could retrieve the file Carter needed, he'd get closer to the truth. He'd get closer to finding out who was pulling the strings behind everything. The people who had set him up, who had betrayed him. The ones who had used Tommy as a pawn in their game. And Clint wasn't going to let them win. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Clint knew the clock was ticking, and the sooner he could complete the job, the sooner he could get back to finding out who was behind the conspiracy that had turned his life upside down. He spent hours gathering intel on the high-tech facility that Carter had pointed him toward. The location was a private research center, located on the outskirts of the city. From the outside, it looked like any other nondescript building, but Clint knew better. Places like these were often a front for much more covert operations. Clint was well-versed in infiltration, but this place was different. The security was state-of-the-art. Cameras covered every inch of the exterior, and guards were posted around the perimeter, armed and alert. Getting inside wouldn't be easy, but Clint had done harder jobs. He ran through the plan in his head one last time. First, he'd need to get close enough to the building to disable the security system. There was a weak point in the perimeter fence that he had located from the map Carter had given him. Once inside, he'd have to navigate the building's labyrinth of hallways and corridors to reach the server room. There, he'd extract the file Carter wanted, breaking through the encryption on the spot. It sounded simple enough on paper, but Clint knew that nothing was ever simple when it came to operations like this. There were always variables, unknowns he couldn't plan for. The key to survival was always adaptability. As Clint gathered his gear and prepared for the mission ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling faster than he could control. With Tommy now fully aligned with the enemy, Clint had no one left to trust except Michael, and even that was uncertain. The only thing he knew for sure was that there was no turning back. Clint left his apartment before dawn, his mind focused on the task ahead. The mission wasn't just about retrieving a file anymore. It was about something much bigger. The truth. The people who were pulling the strings. And the consequences of the choices he was making. As he drove toward the facility, Clint's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. This was the point of no return, and he was ready to face whatever came next. The air was crisp as Clint parked his car a few miles away from the research facility. The sun had just begun to rise, casting long shadows over the quiet streets. He'd taken every precaution to ensure that he wasn't followed. The last thing he needed was to be ambushed before he even reached the facility. Clint slipped out of the car, adjusting the straps on his bag. He had everything he needed, tools for breaking and entering, a few weapons just in case things went south, and the resolve to make it through this. His fingers brushed over the edges of the envelope in his jacket pocket, the one that contained the map of the facility and the access codes Carter had promised. The man had kept his end of the bargain so far. It was up to Clint to do the same. The facility was a few miles off the main road, nestled against a patch of dense forest. From the outside, it looked deceptively ordinary, but Clint knew better than to underestimate a place like this. The high walls topped with barbed wire, the security cameras mounted at every corner. It was clear that the people who ran this place weren't concerned about attracting attention. They were concerned with keeping secrets. He set off on foot, cutting across a field that led to the back of the facility. His movements were calculated, slow but purposeful. The air was still, save for the faint hum of electricity running through the fences, which Clint knew would trigger an alarm if he weren't careful. He reached the perimeter fence and paused, listening for any sounds of movement. There was a guard tower in the distance, but he was sure he had time. The map Carter had provided listed a small gap in the fence, a spot where the wiring was slightly damaged. That was his entry point. Clint dropped to his knees, using his tools to quietly cut the chain link and remove a section of the fence. The metal groaned as it gave way, but the sound was muffled by the rustling of the wind in the trees. He slipped through the gap and crouched low, making his way toward the back of the building, where he could access the service entrance. The building loomed ahead, a sprawling structure made of cold concrete and steel. He could see the reflection of the security cameras moving across the outer walls, but he knew the best way to avoid detection was to stay out of their line of sight. He moved like a shadow, blending into the darkness of the early morning hours. The service entrance was just ahead. It was locked, of course, but Clint had prepared for this. He pulled out his lockpicks, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. With a few quick movements, the lock clicked open. He eased the door open and stepped inside. The first thing Clint noticed was the silence. Inside the building, everything was still. No hum of machinery, no voices echoing down the halls. It felt almost too quiet, like the calm before a storm. His senses were on high alert as he navigated the hallway, following the map in his mind. The server room was located on the second floor, but Clint had to go through a maze of narrow hallways and stairwells to get there. He crept through the building, avoiding security cameras and guards, keeping to the shadows. The faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, but Clint didn't stop. He knew better than to freeze. Movement was key. He couldn't afford to make a wrong move. It took him 10 minutes to reach the staircase. As he ascended, he took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Every part of him was on edge. If he messed this up, it wasn't just the file he'd be risking. It was his life. Clint reached the second floor and silently moved to the corridor that led to the server room. There were more guards here, patrolling at regular intervals. He flattened himself against the wall, watching one of the guards pass by. When the man was out of sight, Clint moved quickly, slipping past him and through the door to the server room. Inside, the room was exactly as Clint had expected, cold, sterile, with rows of servers humming quietly. The room was well lit, but Clint didn't waste time admiring the high-tech equipment. He scanned the room for the access terminal that Carter had mentioned. There it was, in the back corner, next to a row of servers. It looked just like any other terminal, but Clint knew it was where the encrypted file was stored. He moved swiftly, setting his bag on the floor beside the terminal. His fingers flew over the keyboard, bypassing the initial security protocols. The system was sophisticated, but Clint was better. He could feel the tension mounting in his chest as he worked. Each second that passed felt like an eternity. Suddenly, a beep sounded. Clint froze, his eyes darting to the door. Had someone triggered the alarm? He waited, holding his breath, listening intently. But nothing happened. He exhaled slowly and turned his attention back to the screen. The system was unlocking. He was in. Clint quickly searched through the files until he found the one Carter had mentioned. It was a large file, encrypted with layers of security, but Clint's skills were up to the task. He inserted a thumb drive into the terminal and began transferring the data. A few seconds into the transfer, Clint heard footsteps approaching outside the door. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't going to have much time. The file was almost done, but he needed to move. He grabbed the thumb drive and stuffed it into his pocket, quickly packing up his equipment. The footsteps grew louder, now just outside the door. Clint glanced at the terminal one last time, confirming that the file had been successfully transferred. Without thinking twice, he bolted for the exit. He yanked open the door just as a guard rounded the corner, and the two men locked eyes for a split second before Clint slammed the door shut behind him and sprinted down the hallway. The sound of the guard's footsteps grew louder as he shouted into his radio. Clint knew he had seconds, maybe a minute before the alarm would be raised, and the building would be locked down. He made a sharp turn down another hallway and ducked into a maintenance closet, closing the door quietly behind him. He crouched low, holding his breath as the sounds of footsteps and shouting echoed through the building. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. But Clint was nothing if not patient. He knew how to wait. He let the chaos outside pass, keeping his focus sharp, his mind clear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the noise subsided. He heard a few guards pass by, but none came near his hiding spot. Clint exhaled slowly, waiting a few more minutes before he crept out of the closet and made his way back toward the service entrance. This time, getting out was easier. The guards were distracted by the alarm, and the security cameras had shifted focus. Clint was in the clear. When he reached the gap in the fence, he slipped through without a sound. His heart was still racing, but he was alive. The job was done. He didn't stop to look back as he made his way to the car. The data was secure, and that was all that mattered. But as Clint started the engine and drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get a lot more dangerous. The real battle was just beginning. Clint glanced at the thumb drive in his pocket. This was the key to uncovering the conspiracy. But he knew that whoever was behind this would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. And Clint wasn't sure if he was ready for what he was about to uncover. Clint sat in the car, the engine idling in the parking lot of a nondescript coffee shop. He had just returned from the facility, the thumb drive still warm in his pocket. He hadn't dared look at the files yet. He needed a moment to collect himself before diving into the storm that was sure to follow. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the danger he was in, and the fact that there was no turning back. He took a deep breath and looked around the empty parking lot. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind of day where everything seemed still. Too still. Clint had learned a long time ago that nothing was ever as peaceful as it seemed. People like Carter didn't make deals out of kindness. They had their own agendas. And Clint had a sinking feeling that whatever was on that thumb drive was going to lead him into deeper, darker waters than he could have ever imagined. After another long moment of hesitation, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the thumb drive. His fingers hovered over the ignition for a moment, debating whether he should go home or just head straight to a safe house. But he knew he needed to know what was inside the files. He couldn't afford to waste time. He pulled out his laptop and plugged the drive in. The device recognized the drive immediately, and a folder opened on the screen. Clint's breath caught in his throat. The contents were vast, dozens of files, some encrypted, others in plain text. Clint's eyes narrowed as he skimmed through the first few files, his fingers pausing on a document that caught his attention. It was a detailed dossier. Names, dates, locations, and events all connected by a single thread. The conspiracy that had torn his life apart. Clint's pulse quickened as he read through the names. They were familiar. Politicians, corporate tycoons, military personnel, powerful people who, on the surface, seemed unconnected. But as he dug deeper, the connections became clearer. This wasn't just some random operation. This was a well-oiled machine that had been manipulating events for years, and Clint had been nothing more than a pawn in their game. The files included information about Tommy, his involvement in a covert mission that had gone wrong, and the people who had framed Clint for a crime he didn't commit. It also outlined several high-level operations that involved the illegal arms trade, money laundering, and blackmail. Clint leaned back in his chair, the weight of the discovery hitting him like a freight train. His stomach churned as he realized the depth of the corruption he was up against. People had died for this. His family, his friends. Everything he had ever known had been taken from him by people with far too much power. But there was one name that stood out above all others, a name Clint had been hoping to never see again. James Connolly. Clint's mind raced. James Connolly was the very man who had orchestrated the entire conspiracy. He was the mastermind behind it all, the one who had used Tommy as a pawn and had manipulated Clint every step of the way. The files didn't just implicate Connolly, they proved he was the one pulling all the strings. Anger flared within Clint as he read through the information about Connolly. He had known the man for years, respected him, even called him a friend. But Connolly was nothing more than a snake in the grass. A traitor. And now Clint had the proof. He slammed his fist against the table, the sound echoing in the otherwise empty coffee shop. The realization hit him hard. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for his survival. The people who had destroyed his life would stop at nothing to protect themselves, and Clint was standing right in the middle of their crosshairs. But this time, he wasn't going to back down. He scanned the rest of the files quickly, hoping to find some kind of plan or a clue that would lead him to Connolly. And then he found it, an encrypted document with a single line of text. Operation Eclipse, Final Phase. Clint's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the cryptic message. What was Operation Eclipse? What was the final phase? He couldn't waste any more time. He had to find out what it meant. But he knew the risks. If Connolly had been behind everything, then getting close to him was a dangerous game. Clint needed backup. He couldn't do this alone. He quickly packed up his laptop and thumb drive, deciding it was time to bring Michael into the fold. He needed someone he could trust, someone who knew the ropes, someone who had experience in taking down the kind of people Clint was up against. Michael was the one person Clint knew could help him figure out what to do next. But first, he needed to get out of sight. The last thing Clint wanted was to lead the people hunting him right to Michael. The walls were closing in, and Clint didn't have the luxury of time. He slipped out of the coffee shop and made his way to his car. The world outside felt different now, darker. The people Clint had once trusted were all part of the puzzle, but now they were the enemy, and he was done playing by their rules. Clint drove to Michael's place, his thoughts racing as he navigated the empty streets. It wasn't just about the conspiracy anymore. It was about survival. He couldn't trust anyone, not even Carter. He had no idea who was truly on his side. But Michael had always been loyal, even when things seemed impossible. When Clint arrived at Michael's apartment, he parked a few blocks away, keeping his distance to avoid being seen. He couldn't afford to be too careful, not when the people he was up against had eyes everywhere. Clint made his way to the back of the building and slipped in through the rear entrance. Michael's apartment was on the top floor, and Clint knew the layout by heart. He had spent enough time here to know the place like the back of his hand. He knocked quietly on the door, making sure no one was around to hear. After a few moments, the door opened, and Michael stood there, looking surprised but also wary. "Clint," Michael said, his voice low. "What the hell's going on?" Clint stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, closing the door behind him. "You need to see something," Clint said, his voice urgent. He pulled the thumb drive out of his pocket and handed it to Michael. "This is it. The proof." Michael took the drive and inserted it into his computer. As the files began to open, Clint could see the realization dawning on Michael's face. "James Connolly," Michael muttered, shaking his head. "I knew something was off about him." Clint's fists clenched. "We need to stop him, Michael. We need to end this, once and for all." Michael didn't say anything at first, his gaze fixed on the screen. Finally, he spoke, his voice grim. "You're right, but this is going to be bigger than anything we've faced before. If we're going after Connolly, we have to be prepared for anything." Clint nodded. He was done being a pawn. It was time to play the game his way, and no one, not even Connolly, was going to stop him. The flickering light from Michael's computer screen illuminated the room, casting long shadows on the walls. Clint paced back and forth as Michael scrolled through the files on the thumb drive. Each page revealed more about James Connolly's vast network, and Clint could feel the weight of their implications growing heavier by the second. "Look at this," Michael said suddenly, his voice low, tinged with disbelief. Clint stopped in his tracks and walked over to his friend's side, peering at the screen. It was a set of blueprints, detailing a high-security facility that Clint had never seen before. The location was marked in the top left corner, Eclipse Research Facility, deep in the heart of Nevada. There were coordinates, but they were more than just numbers. They were instructions, laying out a precise plan to transport something, or someone, into the facility. Michael clicked on another file. It was a list of names, high-profile individuals from various sectors: military, intelligence, private security, and even political figures. At the top of the list was Connolly's name, surrounded by the names of a few others Clint recognized. But it was the last name that caught his eye. B. Harper. Clint's gut twisted. He knew that name. It was the same name attached to the military operation that had gotten Tommy killed. Harper had been involved in the entire cover-up. He had been involved in everything. "This is it, Clint," Michael said quietly, breaking his reverie. "This is the culmination of everything Connolly's been working toward. Operation Eclipse. It's not just about control, it's about power." He's got something big planned, and it's all centered around this facility. Clint's eyes were narrowed, his jaw tight with anger. If Connolly's at the center of all this, he won't stop until everything's in his control. We need to shut this down now. Michael looked at him, his face a mask of concentration. We can't just storm in there. The place is a fortress. We'd need a small army to break in. Clint took a deep breath, considering the situation. We don't need an army. We just need the right intel, the right allies. And we need to be smart. Michael's gaze flickered to Clint, and he nodded. Okay, what's the plan? Clint didn't hesitate. We find out what's really going on inside that facility. We gather intel, figure out who's involved, and then we make sure Connolly's operation comes to a screeching halt. But to do that, we need to get in, get the information, and get out without anyone knowing we were ever there. Michael leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on the desk. All right, so we need to infiltrate the Eclipse research facility, figure out what Connolly's planning, and disable the operation before it goes any further. And we need to do all of that without getting caught. Sounds like a walk in the park. Clint cracked a small, dry smile. It's not going to be easy, but I've done worse. True, Michael replied, though there was a faint trace of concern in his voice. But there's one thing we haven't talked about yet. How do we deal with the people working for Connolly? They won't just let us waltz in. Clint's face hardened, his mind already turning. We don't have to deal with everyone. We just need to get to the ones at the top. Connolly's associates, Harper, Carter, and anyone else in charge. Once they're taken down, the operation falls apart. Michael was silent for a moment, then nodded. Okay, we're going to need gear. The kind of stuff that can get us past their security. And we'll need a way to get out if things go sideways. Clint ran a hand through his hair, considering the situation. I've got a few contacts who can get us what we need. We'll need night vision, hacking tools, and any explosives we can carry. And we'll need to figure out a way to get inside without raising alarms. Michael pulled out a notepad and began jotting down ideas. I can help with the tech side. I've got a few connections who owe me favors. But we'll need to be in and out fast. If Connolly's people catch wind of us, it's over. Clint nodded grimly. We've got one shot at this. If we screw it up, we're dead. But if we succeed, we take Connolly down for good. Michael met Clint's gaze, his expression serious. And what happens after that? Clint didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure he wanted to think about the aftermath. The plan had to work first, and only then would they see what came next. Clint reached into his jacket and pulled out a second envelope. This one was from Carter. Inside was another piece of the puzzle, a list of guards working at the facility, their schedules, and security protocols. It wasn't much, but it was a start. We get our hands on this, and we're one step closer to the truth, Clint said, pushing the list across the table to Michael. Michael glanced over it, his eyes narrowing. This is good, but we'll need to dig deeper. If we're going after Connolly, we need to know exactly what we're walking into. Clint nodded. Agreed. We can't afford surprises. After a few more minutes of planning, the two of them stood up. All right, let's get to work, Clint said. I'll start reaching out to my contacts, Michael said, heading for the door. You focus on making sure we have the firepower we need. Clint watched his friend leave, the weight of what was coming settling on his shoulders. He knew they were walking into the lion's den. The Eclipse research facility wasn't just a building. It was a fortress, and Connolly's operation was more dangerous than anything Clint had ever faced. But he wasn't backing down. Not now, not when he was so close. He turned toward the door, ready to get everything in motion. This was it. This was the moment when everything changed. If they could bring Connolly down, it would be the beginning of the end for the conspiracy that had torn Clint's world apart. And Clint was going to make sure it happened, no matter the cost. The plan was set. There was no turning back now. Clint and Michael had spent the last few days assembling the pieces of the operation. They'd reached out to their contacts, gathered the necessary gear, and formulated a strategy to infiltrate the Eclipse research facility. It had been a whirlwind of phone calls, meetings, and late-night planning sessions. Now, everything was in place. Clint sat in his car, parked a few miles away from the facility, the engine running quietly. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the world in a soft, purple twilight. He glanced at his watch. 9:30 p.m. Michael was already inside, working his magic with the hacking tools they had acquired. His job was to disable the security systems, breach the firewalls, and open a backdoor that would give them access to the facility without triggering any alarms. Clint's job was to get inside, blend in, and make sure everything went according to plan. Clint checked his gear one last time. Night vision goggles, a silenced pistol, a knife, and a small bag of explosives. The weight of the tools on his body was a reminder of how high the stakes were. If they got caught, they'd never make it out alive. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady his nerves. This wasn't his first mission, but it was by far the most personal. Connolly had destroyed everything Clint held dear. Now, Clint was going to take him down. Clint pulled his hood up, hiding his face in the shadow of the car's interior. He glanced at the facility once more. A sprawling complex surrounded by tall fences and multiple security checkpoints. The only way in was through a series of maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the facility. Michael had already unlocked the path, and Clint had memorized the map. He knew exactly where to go. Taking a deep breath, Clint pushed the door open and stepped into the night. The cold air hit his skin, but he barely felt it. His mind was locked into the task ahead. As he approached the facility's perimeter, Clint moved quickly and quietly, sticking to the shadows. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he kept his breathing steady, his focus sharp. He didn't have the luxury of making mistakes tonight. Not when Connolly's operation was on the line. The first security checkpoint loomed ahead. A small guard booth was stationed near the entrance, and two armed guards were standing outside, chatting quietly. Clint stopped in his tracks, staying hidden in the dark. The last thing he needed was to be spotted before he made it to the tunnels. He checked his watch again. Michael had to be in position by now. A faint beep from his earpiece confirmed that the security system had been bypassed. Clint exhaled a sigh of relief, but he knew it was only the first step. He still had to get past the guards. He waited for the right moment. The guards were distracted, talking about their shifts. The longer they talked, the better. Clint couldn't afford any distractions. Finally, one of the guards turned and walked toward the building, leaving the other behind. Clint seized the opportunity. He moved swiftly and silently, his steps measured and precise. In a fluid motion, he slipped behind the remaining guard and covered his mouth with one hand. The guard struggled for a moment, but Clint's grip was firm, and within seconds, the guard went limp, unconscious. Clint carefully laid him on the ground and checked for any signs of identification. Nothing of use. The guard was just another cog in Connolly's machine, and Clint was one step closer to dismantling that machine. He darted past the booth and toward the maintenance tunnel entrance, a small hatch hidden beneath some overgrown shrubs. The hatch was old but sturdy, and with a twist of the handle, Clint was inside. The tunnel was narrow, dimly lit by a few flickering bulbs. It smelled musty, the air stale and thick. Clint pressed forward, staying low and quiet. The sound of his footsteps was muffled by the dirt floor, but he could hear the hum of the facility above him, the constant drone of machinery, the distant murmur of voices. Clint's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but he kept his focus sharp. Michael was waiting for him at the designated entry point, ready to provide him with any intel or updates. They had a limited window of time before the system would go back online and security would be reactivated. Every minute counted. As Clint approached the end of the tunnel, he heard a faint sound, a door opening. He froze, pressing his back against the cold, concrete wall. There were voices ahead. Two guards, moving toward him. He couldn't be caught now. Not after everything. Clint quickly glanced around. There was a small alcove in the tunnel, just large enough for him to crouch in. He darted toward it and hid in the shadows, holding his breath. The guards' footsteps grew louder as they approached. Clint's muscles tensed, every nerve screaming for him to move, to take action. But he stayed still. The guards passed by, completely unaware of his presence. His heart was pounding in his ears, but he managed to keep quiet, waiting until the sound of their footsteps faded. Only then did he let out a long, slow breath, his grip tightening on the silenced pistol at his side. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, urging him forward. Clint moved quickly now, his steps confident and steady. He reached the end of the tunnel, where a small service door awaited. This was the point of entry into the facility. Michael had already sent him the access codes, and with a few quick keystrokes on the keypad, the door clicked open. Inside, the facility was a labyrinth of hallways, rooms, and secure areas. Clint's eyes adjusted quickly to the low light, and he moved cautiously, keeping an ear out for any signs of security. The last thing he wanted was to run into another patrol. He reached a control room, where the bulk of the security measures were monitored. Michael had managed to disable most of the surveillance cameras, but Clint knew he needed to get in, get the intel, and get out fast. The room was empty, a few workers having gone home for the night, leaving it abandoned. Clint slipped inside, his eyes scanning the monitors. He located the main database on the system. His heart skipped a beat as he realized that everything he needed, the final pieces of the puzzle, was just within reach. But then, just as he began to access the files, an alarm blared. Clint's body went rigid. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the facility, growing louder by the second. They were on to him. The clock was ticking. There was no time to waste. Clint quickly downloaded the files onto a secure drive, tucking it into his pocket. He wasn't about to let Connolly get away with this. But now, escaping was going to be a lot harder than he thought. The alarm blared in Clint's ears, its shrill tone slicing through the silence like a knife. His heart raced, and his instincts kicked into overdrive. Time was no longer on his side. He needed to get out now. The control room door clicked open, and Clint froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing louder and faster as security personnel rushed to the scene. He cursed under his breath. The mission was far from over. If anything, it had just escalated. His mind raced. The back exit. Michael had mapped out an escape route for him, but it was across the facility, and with the alarm going off, security would be tightening in every corner. Clint's eyes darted across the room, searching for a way out. The window. The room had a single window at the far end, high enough that it wouldn't be spotted by most casual observers. Clint's muscles tensed as he moved toward it, grabbing the metal handle and wrenching it open. The cool night air hit him, and he could see the faint outline of the fences and barbed wire just beyond the perimeter. It wasn't much of a jump, but it was the quickest way out. He didn't hesitate. Clint climbed onto the windowsill, preparing to leap. Just as his feet left the ground, he heard the sound of doors crashing open in the hallway. His heart skipped a beat. They were coming for him. Clint hit the ground with a roll, absorbing the shock of the fall. He barely had time to get his bearings before he heard the unmistakable sound of shouting and boots pounding on the pavement. His legs were already propelling him forward, his body moving on pure instinct. He didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. The barbed wire fence loomed ahead, but Clint was already calculating his next move. He'd trained for situations like this: tight spaces, narrow margins, and split-second decisions. He didn't slow down as he reached the fence. His muscles burned as he gripped the wire, pulling himself up with the kind of strength that had kept him alive in the toughest of situations. Just as he cleared the top, a bright light hit him, blinding him for a moment. The sound of gunfire echoed through the air, the sharp crack of bullets ricocheting off the metal fence. Clint didn't flinch. He dropped down to the other side, landing hard on the ground but quickly rolling to his feet. He was out, but the chase had only just begun. Clint's breath came in quick bursts as he sprinted through the darkened field, zigzagging to avoid being an easy target. He could hear the security team shouting into their radios, coordinating their pursuit. He had to move faster. He had to get to the extraction point before they could trap him. The extraction point. Michael had arranged for a vehicle to pick him up, a black van parked a few miles outside the facility. It was their only chance to escape without being caught. Clint's mind raced as he plotted his next move, calculating the distance and the time it would take for the security teams to converge on him. He pushed himself harder, his legs aching with each step, but there was no turning back now. The facility was still behind him, but it wouldn't be long before they figured out exactly where he'd gone. He needed to stay ahead. Suddenly, a bright light from behind flickered through the trees, followed by the screeching of tires. Clint's heart skipped. The van. Michael had arrived. Without slowing, Clint changed direction, veering off the main path and toward the tree line. He needed to keep his cover. His mind was spinning with possibilities, but there was no time for hesitation. Every second counted. He heard the van's engine roar as it came into view, cutting through the night. Michael, in the driver's seat, had the door open and was waiting for Clint. But the sound of more tires squealing and radios crackling told Clint that they weren't the only ones in pursuit. A black SUV had appeared on the road ahead, blocking their path. "Clint, get in," Michael shouted, his voice frantic. Clint sprinted toward the van, his eyes on the black SUV, now speeding toward them. The headlights glared in his direction, making it difficult to see, but Clint didn't stop. He didn't slow. He couldn't. Just as he reached the open door of the van, gunfire rang out. Clint dove inside, slamming the door shut just as a bullet hit the side of the vehicle. The van rocked under the impact, but it kept moving. "Go, go, go," Clint yelled, adrenaline flooding his system. Michael didn't hesitate. He slammed his foot on the gas, and the van shot forward, swerving to avoid the SUV. Tires screeched against the road as they veered onto the narrow dirt path leading away from the facility. The SUV followed, relentless in its pursuit, but Clint wasn't about to let them catch up. Clint grabbed the bag of explosives from the floor and tossed them into the back of the van. "We need to slow them down. I'll take care of the rear." Michael's hands tightened on the wheel as he glanced at Clint. "Are you sure? We can't afford to stop now." "We don't have a choice," Clint replied through gritted teeth. "Get us to that highway. I'll handle the rest." The van rocked as Michael accelerated, the road growing bumpier and more treacherous. Clint turned to face the back of the vehicle, the weight of the explosives in his hands a reminder of how dangerous this all was. He knew it wasn't just a race to escape anymore. It was a race to survive. The black SUV was still on their tail, but Clint had a plan. He opened the back door slightly, just enough to get a glimpse of the vehicle behind them. It was closing in fast. With a quick motion, he pulled the pin from one of the explosives and hurled it out of the van. The device tumbled through the air, landing right in the path of the SUV. Boom! The explosion rocked the night, a flash of light and debris, sending the pursuing vehicle careening off the road. Clint didn't stop to watch. He turned back around, focusing on the road ahead. The explosion had given them the breathing room they needed, but it wouldn't be long before more security was on the way. "We're clear for now," Clint said, his voice steady despite the chaos. Michael let out a long breath, his hands still white-knuckled on the wheel. "You're insane. You know that?" Clint smirked, though the tension was still thick in the air. "Yeah, well, insanity's been working for me." For now, they were safe. But Clint knew it wouldn't last. This was just the beginning. Connolly wouldn't stop until he had Clint and Michael both dead. And Clint wasn't about to give up without a fight. The van sped down the winding, moonlit road, its tires kicking up dust and gravel as it navigated through the dense forest. Clint stared out the side window, the landscape a blur of shadows and faint moonlight. His heart had slowed to a steady thrum, but his mind was still racing. The night had been chaotic, and while they had managed to escape from the Eclipse research facility, Clint knew they weren't safe yet. He'd caught a glimpse of the black SUV they'd outrun. He was sure that wasn't the last they'd see of it. But as they drove farther into the wilderness, his thoughts began to shift to the next stage of the mission, the final confrontation with Connolly. Clint had long suspected that there was something off about Connolly's operation. It was too big, too organized, too slick. The way it had all unfolded made no sense. And Clint wasn't the type of person to leave things to chance. There had to be a deeper layer to this than just a ruthless businessman with a knack for technology and manipulation. He was playing a game, and Clint was determined to figure out the rules. The only problem? He had to do it before Connolly found them, and put an end to their lives once and for all. Michael glanced over at Clint, breaking him out of his thoughts. "You're quiet. What's going on in that head of yours?" Clint didn't respond immediately, his eyes still fixed on the road ahead. He had been pondering their next move, trying to piece together everything they had learned so far. He had to make sure they weren't walking into another trap. "There's something we missed," Clint said, his voice low and steady. Michael raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Clint turned his gaze toward Michael, his expression serious. The whole operation, Connolly's research, the people he's got working for him. It's all too well-funded, too methodical. If he's just a tech mogul running some shady projects, it doesn't explain the extent of the security, the resources he's pulling in. There's someone bigger behind this. Michael shook his head slightly, digesting the information. You think there's another player involved? Clint nodded. I'm sure of it. This isn't just about power or money anymore. There's a bigger agenda at play. We need to dig deeper, find out who else is involved and what they want. I get it, Michael replied, his tone grim. So, what's our next move? Clint's jaw tightened. We need to get inside Connolly's inner circle. That means we need to get to him. Directly. Michael furrowed his brow. How? We can't just walk into his office and have a nice chat? Clint smirked slightly, the corners of his lips curling up. No, we can't. But we can create a diversion. We find someone close to him, someone who has access to his inner circle, and we make them work for us. Michael was silent for a moment, processing Clint's words. So, we're going to manipulate one of Connolly's people? That's the plan, Clint confirmed, his eyes narrowing with determination. We'll use whatever we can. Money, leverage, whatever it takes to get inside. Once we're in, we get answers. We expose everything, and we bring Connolly down. There was a heavy silence in the van, the tension thick in the air. Michael knew Clint was right. They had no other choice. If they didn't act quickly, Connolly would continue to operate without anyone challenging him. The stakes were too high. There was no time to waste. We need to find someone with access, Clint continued, his voice steady. Someone who can get us close to Connolly. And that someone needs to be someone who doesn't realize they're being used. Michael nodded, the wheels turning in his head. I think I know just the person. Clint glanced over at him. Who? Rachel, Michael said, his voice hesitant. She works directly under Connolly. She's been in his inner circle for a while now. I've seen her around the facility. She's good at keeping her head down, blending in, but she's smart. Too smart. She might just be looking for an out. Clint thought for a moment, his mind already running through the possibilities. And you think she'll help us? Michael hesitated again, as though considering the risk. She might, if we play it right. But it's not going to be easy. Connolly keeps a close watch on his people. Getting to Rachel without raising suspicion will take finesse. Clint leaned back in his seat, his eyes glancing out the window as he considered the plan. He knew the risks. If Rachel couldn't be swayed, they'd have to figure out another way in. But for now, she was their best shot. We'll reach out to her, Clint said finally. Set up a meeting. We don't have a lot of time, so we'll need to move quickly. Michael gave a small nod. All right, I'll work on making contact. If Rachel's willing to help, she'll need to know how serious this is. We don't just need information. We need her to trust us. Clint's gaze hardened. If she doesn't trust us, we'll have to make her. The van turned off the dirt road and onto a paved highway that stretched ahead into the unknown. Clint watched the passing landscape, lost in thought, wondering how much farther they had to go before they had answers. The pieces were finally starting to come together, but there were still so many unknowns. Connolly was powerful, but Clint wasn't backing down. Michael cleared his throat, breaking the silence. We'll need a plan for when we meet her. If she's going to be on our side, we need to show her we're serious. Clint nodded, his jaw set. We'll be ready. By the time they reached the safe house, Clint's mind was already on the next step. He and Michael had learned all they could from their limited resources, but they knew they were running out of time. Rachel could be their key to everything. The way to take Connolly down, expose the shadowy figures behind him, and finally uncover the truth. But with every move they made, they were one step closer to a showdown. And Clint knew that when it came, there would be no turning back. The safe house was silent when Clint and Michael arrived, the kind of quiet that made the air feel thick, as though it were waiting for something to break. Clint pushed open the door and stepped inside, his eyes scanning the small, dimly lit room. It was exactly what they needed, remote, secluded, away from any prying eyes. Michael followed him in, locking the door behind him. We're good for now, he said, glancing at Clint. But Rachel's not going to make this easy. She's been loyal to Connolly for years. If we push her too hard, she might just turn on us. Clint walked over to a table near the window, pulling out a chair and sitting down. He folded his arms across his chest, looking out at the darkened woods surrounding the safe house. We don't have time for subtlety. If she's going to help us, she needs to see the bigger picture. We'll show her exactly what Connolly is capable of. Michael took a deep breath, rubbing his temple as he sat down across from Clint. And if she doesn't take the bait? Clint's eyes narrowed, a steely glint flashing in them. Then we'll have to give her a reason to. I'm not walking away from this without answers. The weight of their situation hung in the air. Every move they made had to be calculated, but the stakes were high. They had no room for error. If Rachel didn't agree to help them, they'd be stuck. And if Connolly found out they were after him, it would be the end of the line. Michael stood up, his face serious. I'll reach out to her tonight. We'll set up a meeting, but I'll make sure she's the one who initiates contact. That way, it looks like she's the one pulling the strings. Clint didn't respond right away, still lost in thought. Do you trust her? I trust her ability to get the job done, Michael replied. But trust is a two-way street. She needs to believe we're on her side, that we're not just using her as a pawn. Clint's jaw clenched. We're using everyone as pawns right now. The question is, who's going to make the first move? There was a long silence between them. Michael didn't argue. He knew Clint was right. They were all just pieces in a larger game, and if they didn't play it well, they could all lose. Michael turned and walked over to a small desk against the far wall, pulling out a burner phone. I'll send the message, but we need to be ready. If Rachel's hesitant or refuses, we'll have to move fast. Clint stood up and moved to the small kitchen area, grabbing a bottle of water. I'm ready. As Michael sent the message, Clint's thoughts returned to Connolly. They were getting closer, but Connolly had people everywhere. He'd underestimated the man's reach at first, but now Clint knew that Connolly had been playing him from the beginning. If they were going to bring him down, they needed more than just information. They needed leverage. And Clint knew exactly what that leverage was. It didn't take long before Michael received a response. He stared at the phone for a moment, then looked up at Clint. She wants to meet. Clint nodded, his mind already racing. Where? A place called the Vault. It's a bar on the outskirts of town. Low-key. Not too many questions asked. Michael hesitated. I'll go with you. We'll play this carefully. Clint shook his head. You stay here. If something goes wrong, I'll need you to be ready to move. Michael opened his mouth to protest, but stopped himself. Clint was right. If Rachel had second thoughts or if things went south, Michael would be the one to get them out of there. The less attention they drew, the better. All right. But be careful, Michael said, his voice carrying the weight of concern. Clint gave him a small nod. I always am. The drive to the vault was uneventful, the darkness swallowing up the road ahead. As Clint neared the bar, he could feel the tension creeping up his spine. This was it, the moment where everything could go right, or everything could fall apart. He parked the van a few blocks away, making sure to keep it hidden in the shadows. The air felt cold as he stepped out of the vehicle and made his way down the dimly lit street. His hand hovered near the sidearm at his waist, a subtle reminder of how dangerous this situation could turn at any moment. The vault wasn't much to look at, a small, nondescript building with a neon sign that buzzed weakly. The windows were tinted, and the sound of muffled conversation spilled out from the cracks in the door. Clint approached with caution, his senses heightened, every muscle in his body alert to any potential danger. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with smoke and the hum of quiet chatter. Clint scanned the room quickly, his eyes locking on a lone figure sitting at the far corner booth. She was wearing a dark coat, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. Rachel. Clint didn't waste any time. He walked straight toward her, his steps purposeful. She looked up as he approached, her face betraying no emotion, but Clint could see the guarded look in her eyes. She wasn't here by choice, not entirely. He slid into the booth across from her, leaning in slightly, his voice low. Rachel, I didn't think you'd agree to meet. Her lips curved into a tight smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I didn't have much of a choice, did I? Clint leaned back, studying her carefully. You have a choice. Everyone does. Rachel's eyes flickered with something. Fear, maybe, or regret. But Clint didn't have time to analyze it. He had to push forward. We both know what Connolly's capable of. He's not just running tech projects. He's running a criminal empire. And you're in the middle of it. Rachel's fingers tapped nervously on the table, her gaze flickering toward the door. I don't know what you think you're doing, Clint, but you're playing a dangerous game. If Connolly finds out you're involved, he'll kill me, Clint interrupted. I'm not afraid of him, but you should be. You think you're safe working for him, but you're just another pawn in his game. And you won't be safe forever. Rachel stiffened, her eyes narrowing. What do you want from me? Clint leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. I want you to help me take him down. The room seemed to hold its breath as Rachel considered his words. The tension was palpable. Finally, she spoke, her voice a mere whisper. What's in it for me? Clint's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. A future without him. For a moment, Rachel didn't respond, but Clint could see the doubt in her eyes. She was close to cracking, and Clint knew it was only a matter of time before she gave in. He just needed to make sure that time was on his side. Rachel sat in silence, her eyes darting between Clint and the door behind him. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like it could choke them both. Clint watched her carefully, noticing the way her fingers still trembled on the edge of her glass, her resolve clearly wavering. He knew she was close. All he had to do now was push a little further. You don't trust me, Clint said, his voice calm but direct. And I get it. But what you don't seem to realize is that you don't have a choice anymore. Connolly owns you. He owns everyone who works for him. He's not just going to let you walk away, Rachel. If you think you're safe, you're wrong. Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line, but Clint could see the fight fading in her eyes. She wasn't as secure in her position as she pretended to be. She was already calculating her options. Clint knew it. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, almost too quietly to hear, she spoke. What's your plan? Clint leaned in, his voice low but urgent. I need you to help me get close to Connolly. You've got the connections. You know who he trusts. You know who's feeding him information. I need access to his inner circle. Rachel shook her head slightly, her expression a mixture of fear and disbelief. You don't understand. You think I have connections? I'm just a cog in the machine. Connolly doesn't trust anyone. And if I even so much as hint that I'm not loyal, I'm dead. Clint nodded, acknowledging her fear. He could see it written all over her face. This wasn't just about a job for Rachel. This was about survival. But Clint couldn't afford to let her hesitation get in the way. Then let me make it clear. You're already a target. You're already in deep. The only way out is through us, Rachel. If we take Connolly down, we give you the chance to live. Without him, without the constant fear. Rachel's eyes flickered with something. Maybe hope, maybe desperation. But before she could speak, Clint pressed on. You're not alone in this. We have people, we have resources. All we need is you. The words seemed to hang in the air, the weight of what Clint was offering settling between them. Rachel was caught between the life she had built with Connolly, the man who had given her power and purpose, and the reality of what he was truly capable of. She was stuck in a trap, and Clint had just offered her the key to escape. I don't know if I can, Rachel whispered, her voice shaky. I don't know if I can do it. I've been with him for too long. Clint gave her a moment to process, then leaned in just a little closer, his voice a mixture of empathy and resolve. If you stay with him, you're just as much a part of his game as everyone else. You're not free. And one day, when he's done with you, you'll be the one he leaves behind. You have to make a choice now. Rachel met his gaze, her eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity. But Clint held her stare, showing her nothing but absolute certainty. He wasn't lying. He wasn't promising her anything he couldn't deliver. This wasn't about sympathy, it was about survival. Finally, Rachel's shoulders slumped, the fight leaving her. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if to gather her strength, then opened them again and looked Clint dead in the eye. All right, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll help you. But you need to know, it's not going to be easy. Connolly's not stupid. He'll be watching. Clint's expression softened just a fraction. I know, and we'll be ready. The meeting ended quickly after that. Rachel insisted on keeping their conversation brief, and Clint respected that. The more time they spent here, the more likely it was that someone would notice their absence. He could sense the lingering fear in Rachel. She was still unsure, but the decision had been made. She was now on their side, whether she liked it or not. As Clint stood to leave, he looked back at Rachel one last time. Her eyes were a little less guarded now, but Clint knew that was just the calm before the storm. She was in deep, and there was no going back for her either. We'll be in touch, Clint said, his voice low. You've made the right choice. Don't forget that. Rachel didn't answer, just nodded once. Her face was unreadable now, but Clint could see the weight of the decision settling in. He turned and walked out of the bar, the cool night air hitting him as he stepped into the street. As he moved down the sidewalk toward the van, his mind raced. He had no idea what kind of trouble they were about to get into, but one thing was clear. Connolly wasn't going to let this go. Not without a fight. Michael was waiting in the van, leaning against the side with his arms crossed. He raised an eyebrow as Clint approached. How'd it go? Clint slid into the driver's seat, starting the engine. She's in, but this won't be easy. Connolly's not stupid. He'll know something's up before long. I figured, Michael said with a grim smile. But now we've got a chance. At least we can move forward. Clint nodded, his expression hardening. We'll need to move fast. We don't have much time. Connolly's not the only one looking for us. As the van pulled away from the curb, Clint glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the bar fade into the distance. It was a moment of victory, but it was fragile, like glass ready to shatter at any second. The next few days would be critical. They had Rachel on their side, but that didn't guarantee success. If they were going to take down Connolly and everyone he worked with, they had to stay one step ahead. And Clint was determined to make sure they did. The war was only just beginning. The next few days passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Clint and Michael were moving on two fronts, trying to gather the intel they needed while staying one step ahead of Connolly's men. The stakes had never been higher, and neither of them could afford to make a misstep. Rachel had agreed to help, but her role was critical. She was their link to Connolly's inner circle. If she was going to stay in the game, they had to make sure she stayed out of harm's way long enough to be useful. Clint spent most of his time on the phone, coordinating with his contacts, trying to dig up dirt on Connolly's operations. Michael, always the strategist, worked on the logistics, timing, locations, safe houses, escape routes. They needed to plan every move down to the last detail. There was no room for error. Clint glanced over at Michael, who was hunched over a stack of files in the corner of the safe house, his brow furrowed in concentration. Any updates? Clint asked, breaking the silence. Michael didn't look up, but his fingers tapped rhythmically on the desk as he shuffled through papers. I've got a lead on Connolly's safe houses. If we can hit one of them, it'll force him to react. We just need to know when and where. Clint nodded, his fingers drumming against the table in thought. And Rachel? Michael paused, finally looking up. She's been in contact with his people. She's nervous, but she's trying to get Connolly to trust her again. He's suspicious of anyone who gets too close, so she has to be careful. But she's doing her part. She's told them about a new operation he's planning. Clint's jaw tightened at the mention of Connolly's operations. They were getting closer to uncovering the full extent of his network. If they could take down his supply chains, his financial backing, they would cripple him. But the clock was ticking. Every minute they wasted gave Connolly more time to get suspicious, to cover his tracks. Do we know what the operation is yet? Clint asked. Not yet, Michael replied. Rachel's working on it. She thinks he'll make his move in the next few days, though. That's when we need to strike. Clint stood up, stretching his legs. All right, we'll move when she's ready. In the meantime, we need to be prepared for a fight. Connolly's not going to let us take him down without a war. Michael nodded. I'm already looking into backup options, but if things get too hot, we'll need to move fast. No second chances. Clint's mind was already racing ahead. If they were going to take Connolly down, they needed to hit him where it hurt. It wasn't just about bringing him in. It was about cutting him off from everything he depended on. His connections, his money, his resources. The more they isolated him, the more desperate he would get. And that was when Clint would strike. The next few days passed with little sleep and constant surveillance. Clint's nerves were on edge. Every time Rachel's phone buzzed, he was on alert, waiting for the next piece of information to fall into place. The calm before the storm felt unbearable. Then, the message came. Clint and Michael were sitting in the kitchen, going over the latest intel when Michael's phone vibrated on the table. He looked down, then met Clint's gaze. "It's her," he said, his voice barely a whisper. But then, a sound, a small crackle on the comms, shattered the stillness. It wasn't part of the plan. Clint's heart raced as he realized something had gone wrong. "Move. Now." Clint barked. Gunfire erupted in the distance, and Clint knew immediately they'd been compromised. Connolly's men were closing in. "Get the intel and head to the extraction point," Clint shouted, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Michael was already moving, darting for the exit, his eyes scanning the area for any threats. Clint followed, his hand gripping his weapon tightly, as the sounds of chaos grew louder around them. They had to move quickly, but every step was a risk. They couldn't afford to be caught. As Clint and Michael made their way through the maze of containers, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed behind them. They weren't alone. And just like that, the hunt was on. Clint's mind raced. Connolly was coming for them. This was no longer just about taking him down. It was a fight for survival. The game had changed. The tension in the air was palpable as Clint and Michael sprinted toward the extraction point. Their mission had gone from a calculated operation to a desperate scramble for survival in a matter of moments. The gunfire in the distance was getting closer, echoing through the abandoned warehouse district, and the once calm surroundings now felt like a trap. Clint's breath was steady, but his heart raced as he scanned the shadows, every corner, every alleyway. Connolly's men were closing in. This wasn't just about the mission anymore. It was about making it out alive. "Keep moving," Clint yelled, glancing back to make sure Michael was still with him. They had a few seconds to reach the extraction point, a nondescript van parked near the far side of the warehouse complex. But Clint knew they weren't the only ones who had made plans. Connolly's men were too well organized to let them slip away unnoticed. As they rounded a corner, a pair of headlights flickered on in the distance. A black SUV, its tinted windows obscuring the driver, barreled down the narrow road, headed straight for them. "Shit," Michael cursed, already taking cover behind a stack of metal crates. "It's them." Clint didn't need any more confirmation. He ducked behind the nearest cover, his mind working at 1,000,000 miles an hour. If they didn't get to that van in the next few minutes, they'd be trapped. The SUV screeched to a halt, and Clint knew Connolly's men were out of the car, hunting them down. "I'll draw them out," Clint said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline that flooded his system. "You get to the van. I'll cover you." Michael hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "You're crazy, Clint. This is a suicide mission." Clint gave him a half-smile, a mix of reassurance and grim humor. "I've been through worse. Now go." With a nod, Michael turned and sprinted toward the extraction van. Clint watched him go, then turned his attention to the SUV. It wasn't just any car. It was Connolly's personal convoy. If they wanted to make it out of this, they had to take it down. Clint knew the risk, but he wasn't about to back down now. He moved swiftly, taking cover as another round of gunfire rang out from the opposite direction. They were surrounded. Clint's pulse quickened, but his focus remained razor-sharp. He had to move fast. He slipped out from behind the crate and dashed toward the closest guard, taking him down silently with a swift move. Then he reached for his radio. "Michael, you've got 5 minutes. Get to the van now." "I'm almost there," Michael's voice came through the earpiece, his tone tense but determined. The sound of more footsteps reached Clint's ears. He turned just in time to see another 2 of Connolly's men emerging from the shadows. Without hesitation, Clint fired. One down, then the other. They were quick, but Clint was faster. He didn't have time to waste. The van was their only hope. Behind him, the sound of a second car engine roared to life. Clint knew they weren't going to get another chance. He sprinted for cover again, ducking just as bullets ripped through the air. The men were closing in, But Clint wasn't ready to be caught. Not now. Just as he rounded another corner, he spotted Michael diving into the van. His heart jumped in his chest. "Go! Go!" Clint shouted as he darted into the open, drawing their fire away from Michael. But the instant he took the shot, he knew it wasn't enough. More of Connolly's men had shown up. They were swarming the area now, and the odds were quickly stacking up against them. The van revved its engine and pulled away, but Clint was still in the line of fire. He had only seconds to make it out. He moved toward the edge of the alley, his feet pounding against the pavement, as the SUV came around the corner, aiming straight for him. Then crash. A blinding flash of light, followed by the deafening roar of an explosion. Clint didn't even have time to react as the force knocked him to the ground, his body crashing against the asphalt. The world spun around him, and for a moment, he was disoriented, everything spinning in a haze of smoke and dust. He forced himself to his knees, shaking off the pain, trying to focus. The explosion had taken out the SUV, and the sound of screeching tires told Clint that Michael was still alive. But he wasn't out of danger yet. The van screeched to a halt just a few yards away from him. Michael leaned out of the passenger window, his face covered in grime and sweat. "Clint, get in." Clint pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the pain that shot through his side. He was out of time. He bolted toward the van, moving as fast as his battered body would allow. As he slid into the back seat, Michael slammed the door shut, and they sped off into the night, the sound of gunfire fading behind them. Clint looked out the rear window, but the black smoke from the explosion had already obscured their tracks. They had made it out. For now. But Clint knew it wasn't over. Connolly wouldn't rest until he had them both. The war wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about ending Connolly's reign for good. The next few days were a blur of movement and careful strategy. They couldn't afford to stop now, not when they were this close. Rachel had been the key to getting the intel they needed, but Clint knew they couldn't rely solely on her. The moment Connolly realized he was losing control, he would go on the offensive. Clint was already preparing for the next step. They would strike fast, they would strike hard. But there was one thing Clint knew with certainty. The endgame was approaching. The showdown between him and Connolly was inevitable. And when it came, only one of them would walk away. Clint's hand rested on his gun, his fingers tracing the cool metal, his thoughts steady. The final battle was coming. And this time, Clint was ready. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?